Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The tree had been dead for 16 years. William Archer knew because he'd filed the report himself. Lightning strike, August 2009. Western hemlock at the Miners Ridge Junction. He'd watched it burn. Yet here it stood, bark smooth and green, needles thick with morning dew, growing from ground that should have been empty. William touched the trunk. Solid. Real. His fingers came away sticky with sap. He checked his Garmin GPS. 478573 degree N, 123.88947 degree W. Exactly where the dead tree should be. Where it had been dead for 16 years. Where he'd stood 6 years ago and photographed the charred remains for the incident report. The forest pressed close around him. That peculiar density of the Hoh rainforest sector, where moss grew thick enough to muffle sound. Olympic National Park in October meant wet. Everything perpetually damp, the air itself a living thing you could almost drink. William had worked these trails for 12 years. He knew every junction, every elevation marker, every problematic section where tourists wandered off trail and had to be retrieved. He knew where dead trees stayed dead. His radio crackled. No, he wouldn't think about radios. Not today. Not with Jordan Hayes 36 hours missing and the search window narrowing. 23 years old, experienced hiker, filed a route plan like you're supposed to. Miners Ridge Trail to Elk Lake. 2-day solo trip. Should have checked in yesterday morning. William consulted his paper map, comparing it to the GPS reading. Both agreed. This was the junction. This was where the hemlock had burned. This was where it shouldn't be alive. He forced himself past it, following Jordan's planned route. The trail wound through cathedral groves of Sitka spruce and western red cedar. Trees so massive they predated European contact with the Americas. Nurse logs thick as cars lay decomposing, erupting with new growth. Everything here fed on death, transformed it into something else. William had learned that lesson before. Sarah Voss, 28 years old, 2009. Same sector, same October dampness. He'd been the one to find her pack, torn open, contents scattered across a game trail. They'd searched for 11 days, found nothing else. No body, no explanation. Just the pack and William's certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the search area. A certainty he'd never been able to articulate without sounding insane. The investigation concluded she'd fallen into one of the area's numerous ravines. The forest had simply kept her. William hadn't believed it then. Didn't believe it now. But he'd learned to stop saying so aloud. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up toward Miners Ridge proper. William's knees protested. He was 41 now, not the 35 he'd been when Sarah vanished. The forest didn't care about his age. It didn't change, didn't acknowledge human time. It simply was. Eternal and indifferent. Or so he'd always told himself. At mile marker 4.2 he found the first sign, Jordan's bandana, red with white stars, tied around a branch at eye level. Standard trail marking. I was here, I'm going this way, except the bandana pointed left, off trail, into thick understory where no route existed. William photographed it with his department-issued Nikon, noting the GPS coordinates. He tried the radio, got static. Cell phone showed no signal, as expected. He was alone with whatever Jordan had found important enough to mark. The bandana fluttered in a breeze William couldn't feel. He pushed into the undergrowth, using his Silva compass to maintain bearing. The understory was dense here, Salal and Oregon grape forcing him to move slowly, carefully. His uniform snagged on Devil's Club, the thorns finding skin through the fabric. After 50 yards, he found a gap in the vegetation, almost a path, though nothing official. Game trail, maybe, or something older. The trees changed, subtly at first. The spacing felt wrong, too regular. Not the random distribution of natural growth, but something almost deliberate, as if planted. Except these were old-growth giants, centuries old. William's unease grew with each step. At what his GPS claimed was 0.3 miles from the trail, though it felt like more, he found Jordan's water bottle, half full, abandoned on moss so thick it swallowed his boots to the ankle. No sign of struggle, just the bottle, carefully placed upright as if Jordan intended to return for it. William picked it up. The water was still cold. He called out, "Jordan Hayes, Olympic National Park Service, if you can hear me, call out." The forest swallowed his voice. No echo. The sound simply stopped at the tree line, absorbed by moss and age and something else. William continued forward. The trees were definitely wrong now. He could see it clearly. They formed concentric rings, perfect circles radiating outward from some central point ahead. No natural process created patterns like this. Wind, fire, disease, all left irregular marks. This was intentional. This was impossible. His compass spun lazily, unable to settle on north. William's breath came faster. He recognized this feeling, this specific cocktail of adrenaline and dread. He'd felt it before, standing in this same forest, holding Sarah Voss's torn backpack and knowing, absolutely knowing, that something was watching him. Something that had always been here. Something that didn't want to be found. He should turn back. Radio for support. Except his radio wouldn't work here, he already knew that. Cell phone confirmed it. No service. GPS still functional, but the coordinates seemed wrong somehow. The numbers moving even as he stood still. A branch cracked behind him. William spun, hand on his pepper spray. Nothing. Just trees and moss and the perpetual drip of moisture from the canopy. But he'd heard it clearly. A branch snapping under weight. Something moving. Jordan? His voice sounded small, uncertain. The forest breathed around him. William had read about Leshy during the long nights after Sarah's disappearance, diving into folklore and mythology with the desperation of someone seeking any explanation for the unexplainable. Slavic forest spirits, guardians of wild places. The texts described them as shapeshifters, able to appear as tall as trees or small as grass, leading travelers in circles until they died of exposure. Old world superstition, he'd told himself, nothing relevant to Pacific Northwest forests. But the core idea had stuck with him. Spirits of place, consciousnesses that predated human arrival, that resented intrusion, that defended their territory through disorientation and misdirection rather than violence. That made the forest itself the weapon. William pushed forward. The circular tree pattern grew tighter, drawing him toward its center. Logic screamed at him to retreat, to mark his trail, to follow protocol. But protocol hadn't saved Sarah. Protocol wouldn't save Jordan. And something deeper, more primitive, whispered that he'd been meant to come here, that the forest had been waiting for him, that it remembered. The center of the pattern opened into a clearing, not natural, too perfect. A circle of exposed earth exactly 40 feet in diameter, surrounded by ancient cedars. No undergrowth, no moss, just bare dirt, dark and rich. Jordan Hayes knelt in the middle, back to William, perfectly still. Relief flooded through him. "Jordan! Jordan Hayes!" He started forward. Jordan didn't move. William crossed into the clearing. His boots hit the bare earth and something shifted. Not physically, deeper, as if he'd stepped across a threshold. "Jordan, I'm Ranger William Archer. Are you hurt?" No response. Jordan knelt there, hands on thighs, head slightly bowed, perfectly motionless. William approached slowly, scanning for injuries, for threats, for any explanation. Jordan wore hiking gear, pack still secured, water bottles in place. No visible trauma. But that stillness. He circled around to face Jordan. Empty eyes stared through him. Not dead. William could see Jordan breathing, slow and steady, but absent. Nobody home. The eyes tracked movement like a reflex, but without recognition, without awareness. William keyed his radio. Static. "This is Ranger Archer. I've located the missing person. Adult male, unresponsive but breathing. Possible exposure or head trauma. GPS coordinates are..." He looked at his unit. The numbers scrolled randomly, meaningless. Jordan's lips moved. "Jordan, can you hear me?" William knelt, medical training kicking in, pulse steady, pupils responsive to light. No signs of hypothermia despite the October cold. But those eyes... "Lost," Jordan whispered. Not to William, not to anything present. "You're found now. I'm going to help you up, okay? We're getting out of here." "Lost. We're all lost. The forest knows the way, but we don't listen." Jordan's voice was flat, mechanical. "It's been trying to teach us. It's always been trying." William gripped Jordan's shoulders. "Jordan, look at me. Focus on my voice. Can you hear them?" Jordan's eyes focused suddenly, locked on William with terrible clarity. "They've been calling. The old ones. The first ones. They want to show us. They want us to understand." Footsteps behind him. William spun. Nothing. The clearing remained empty. The circle of trees watching. More footsteps, multiple sources. Surrounding him. Heavy steps crushing undergrowth that wasn't there. "They walk between," Jordan said. "Between the trees. Between moments. They've always walked here. We're the ones who are displaced." William saw them then. Not fully. Shapes moving at the edge of his vision, gone when he turned to look directly. Tall as the cedars but narrow, elongated. Moving through the forest, not around the trees but through them, as if the trunks were merely suggestions. His mind rebelled. Hallucination, carbon monoxide, fungal spores affecting cognition. Any rational explanation. But he'd known. Since Sarah. Since the burned tree that was now alive. He'd known something was wrong with this sector, this specific square mile of forest. Something lived here. Something old. Something that claimed territory. "We have to leave," William said, hauling Jordan to unsteady feet. "Now." Jordan came willingly but woodenly, puppet on strings. William oriented himself, trying to determine the direction back to the trail. His compass spun wildly. GPS showed coordinates that changed with each glance. The sun was invisible through the canopy. He picked a direction that felt right and started walking. The trees rearranged themselves. It happened slowly enough that William couldn't pinpoint the exact moment of change. He'd walk 20 feet, look back, and the path behind him would be different. Trees that should form a corridor now blocked passage. Clear areas became dense undergrowth. The forest was restructuring itself around them. William's training, his 12 years of experience, meant nothing here. You couldn't navigate terrain that refused to stay fixed. He tried marking trees with his knife, blazing a trail. But when he looked back, the marks appeared on different trees, random and meaningless. Jordan walked beside him, neither helping nor hindering, that empty expression never changing. "Sarah," William said, the name escaping before he could stop it. "Sarah Voss, 2009. Was she here? In this place?" Jordan's head turned slowly, mechanically. "She's always here. They all are. Everyone who the forest claimed. They become part of the pattern. Part of the growth cycle. The less she..." Jordan's mouth shaped the word with strange familiarity. "They don't kill. They transform. Incorporate. Everything that dies here feeds the whole." That's not true. That can't be true. But William was moving faster now, dragging Jordan through the undergrowth, branches whipping his face. They had to reach the trail, had to find the boundary where normal forest resumed. If it still existed. If it had ever existed. The circular pattern repeated. Everywhere William turned, trees arranged in perfect rings. Different sizes, different species, but always circles. Concentric patterns drawing his eye inward, to centers he couldn't quite see. His memory fractured. Had he walked this section already? The fallen log looked familiar, but it was too large, or too small. The moss pattern different, same but wrong. Time felt unreliable. His watch showed 2:47 p.m. Looked again. 2:47 p.m. The second hand didn't move. The forest exists outside, Jordan said. That's what they taught me. Outside human time. They measure in tree rings and decomposition. They don't understand our urgency. William's leg trembled, not from exhaustion, from recognition. He was experiencing what Sarah must have experienced, this same disorientation, this same inability to escape. The forest hadn't killed her violently. It had simply kept her, trapped in temporal and spatial loops until her body gave out, or until something else happened. He refused to think about what else might have happened. They emerged into another clearing, different from the first, but somehow identical. Bare earth. Perfect circle. Ancient trees standing guard. In the center, Sarah Voss knelt facing away from them. William's legs failed him. He dropped to his knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. No, you're not real. You're dead. They declared you dead. Sarah turned slowly, the same empty eyes, the same absent presence. But underneath, barely visible, something else. A consciousness that was no longer quite human, adapted to different rhythms, different realities. "Hello, William," she said. Not her voice. Older, layered, as if multiple speakers harmonized. "I've been waiting. The forest said you'd come. Eventually. They always bring back those they want. What happened to you?" The question came out broken. "I listened," Sarah said. "The trees talk if you know how to be quiet. They showed me what this place was before humans, before nations, before names. This was their temple. They are the priests. We're just seeds that landed wrong." Jordan moved to join Sarah, kneeling beside her in the bare earth. Their expressions matched. Empty of human emotion, but full of something else, something ancient and patient. "They want to show you," Sarah continued, "what they showed us. The pattern. Everything grows in patterns. Death feeds life, feeds death. You can't get lost if you stop trying to find your way. I'm getting out of here." William forced himself to stand. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But which direction? The forest shifted constantly now. He could see it happening, trees appearing and disappearing at the edge of his vision, rearranging themselves like pieces on a board. "There's nowhere else," Sarah said gently. "This is the only real place. Everything outside is the illusion. The cities, the roads, the boundaries we draw on maps. Lies humans tell themselves. The forest is truth, the Leshy are truth. They were here first. They'll be here when we're all mulch in memory." William ran. Direction didn't matter. Staying still meant accepting this. He crashed through undergrowth, branches tearing at him, moss grabbing his boots. Behind him he heard nothing. No pursuit. The forest didn't chase. It simply was. Always had been. Always there, no matter which direction he fled. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed against a cedar trunk, older than his species' concept of history. The tree spoke to him, not in words, in impressions, sensations. It showed him time from its perspective. Centuries compressed to moments. Humans arriving, building trails, pretending to own what could never be owned. The Leshy watching with alien amusement. Allowing the intrusion because from their view, humans lasted only seconds. Mayflies pretending to be permanent. But some humans listened, heard the older rhythms, let go of urgency and destination and self, became part of the pattern, joined the slow, patient growth cycle, became forest. William felt it happening, his breathing slowing to match the tree's sap flow, his heartbeat stretching out, measuring time in seasons rather than seconds, the panic in his mind quieting, replaced by ancient patience. No. He bit his lip hard, tasting blood. Pain, human pain, present tense. He was William Archer, 41 years old, ranger. He had a brother in Seattle, a niece he sent birthday cards to, a small apartment in Port Angeles with books he was reading and coffee going stale in the pot. He had a life outside this place. He existed outside this place. The forest's hold loosened slightly. Not much, but enough. William dragged himself upright using the cedar for support. His watch still read 2:47 p.m., but he knew hours had passed. Night would come soon, and night in this part of the forest. He moved with new understanding, not fighting the disorientation, not trying to impose human logic on inhuman geography. Instead, he let his body move instinctively, following gradients he couldn't name. Downhill. Always downhill. Water flows down. Rivers reach seas. Gravity was older than forests, older than Leshy. The trees began to thin, gradually, imperceptibly at first. But the spacing changed, became natural, random. The moss grew thinner. Undergrowth returned to normal density. And then, miraculous, impossible, trail markers. William stumbled onto the Miners Ridge Trail at mile marker 6.8. His GPS suddenly locked, 47.8642 degree on, 123.021 degree abu. His watch unfroze, 6:34 p.m., 4 hours unaccounted for. His radio crackled to life. "Ranger Archer, we've been trying to reach you for hours. What's your status?" William stared at the radio, at the trail, at the forest that now looked like normal forest, dense and damp and indifferent. "Found evidence of Jordan Hayes," he heard himself say. "No sign of the missing person. Continuing search." Lies, but true lies. Jordan was gone in ways that couldn't be explained in reports. Sarah was gone the same way, absorbed, transformed. Whatever they'd become, they weren't human anymore, weren't anything his world had words for. "Copy that, it's getting dark. We're calling search until morning." Understood. William walked the trail toward the parking lot. Each step took effort. Part of him wanted to turn back, to return to those circular clearings, to let the forest have him too. It would be easier, peaceful. The Leshy promised peace. No more questions, no more searching. Just slow transformation into something older and patient. But something stubborn in him refused. He'd gotten out. Sarah hadn't. Jordan hadn't. But he had. And that meant something. Maybe. The parking lot appeared around a bend. His truck sat alone, covered in pollen and fallen needles. He'd been gone 8 hours according to the dashboard clock, though his watch insisted on only 4. William drove down the mountain road, watching the forest recede in his mirrors. But it didn't really recede. He understood that now. The forest had always been there, existing in spaces human perception couldn't quite grasp. The Leshy walked between moments, between trees, between the cracks in reality. They'd let him go. He didn't know why. Maybe because he'd resisted. Maybe because keeping him required effort they didn't want to expend. Maybe because they knew he'd come back. Maybe because they knew he'd never really left. At his apartment, William couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, looking toward the dark line of mountains where Olympic National Park sprawled invisible in the night. Somewhere in that darkness, Sarah and Jordan knelt in circles of bare earth, transforming slowly into something else, becoming guardians, becoming part of the ancient pattern. And somewhere the Leshy walked between the trees, patient and eternal, waiting for the next person to wander too deep into territory they'd never stopped claiming. William's hand shook as he poured whiskey he wouldn't drink. On his kitchen table, his Garmin GPS displayed coordinates. Without thinking, he'd marked the location of that first clearing, the exact center. Part of him had known, even then, that he'd need to find his way back. Because they weren't done with him. The forest never forgot those who'd walked its oldest paths. It marked them, changed them, made them part of something that predated human memory. William closed his eyes and saw trees in perfect circles, drawing inward, inward, forever inward. His watch read 2:47 p.m. It was 1:23 a.m. The pattern was growing in his mind, roots digging deep, spreading. The Leshy's gift, the forest's claim. He could feel it now whenever he closed his eyes. The vast network of consciousness that connected every living thing in those ancient groves. Could hear whispers in a language older than words. Could sense others like Sarah and Jordan, transformed but aware, existing in spaces between human understanding. And he knew, with terrible certainty, That next October, when someone else went missing in that sector, he'd volunteer for the search. He'd return to those circular clearings. He'd kneel in bare earth and finally listen to what the forest had been trying to teach him. The Leshy were patient. They measured time in tree rings. They could wait another year, another lifetime. They'd waited centuries already. What was one more human season? William looked at his reflection in the dark window. For just a moment, he saw trees behind him, tall shapes moving through his apartment, through walls and furniture, walking between moments. When he blinked, they were gone. But he could still feel them watching, always waiting. The forest had marked him, and marks like that never washed away. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Robert Fitzgerald had measured the distance 3 times with 3 different instruments, and the math refused to cooperate. The trail between Cascade Pass and the recovery site was simultaneously 4 miles going north and 7 miles returning south. A physical impossibility that his Garmin, his rangefinder, and his goddamn surveyor's wheel all confirmed. He stood at the trailhead in the thin October light, watching his breath crystallize in air that felt 20 degrees colder than the thermometer claimed. 12 years with the National Park Service had taught him to trust instruments over instinct, but the numbers sprawling across his field notebook belonged in an Escher painting, not the North Cascades. Jordan Hayes had vanished somewhere in that mathematical anomaly 4 days ago. The 26-year-old had logged his route with the ranger station, standard day hike up to Cascade Pass, return by 1800 hours. His Subaru still sat in the parking lot, keys locked inside, registration current. No emergency contacts had been listed. No one had reported him missing until a trail maintenance crew noticed the car on day 3. Fitzgerald had supervised the initial search grid. 32 volunteers, 2 K-9 units, a helicopter from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. They'd found his backpack at mile marker 3.7, contents undisturbed, wallet, phone, energy bars, water filtration system. No signs of animal predation, no blood, no struggle. Just a pack sitting upright on a flat rock as if Hayes had set it down to tie his boot and forgotten to pick it up. The phone had been dead, but Fitzgerald had charged it at the station. The last photo timestamp read 13:47 hours. A selfie of Hayes grinning at the summit, the Cascade Peaks sharp behind him. Nothing after that. The phone's GPS log showed him descending normally until 14:23 hours. Then the signal simply stopped. Not like he'd powered down or lost reception. The log just ended mid-step, the final coordinates placing him on a straightforward section of trail with clear sight lines in all directions. That had been victim number 4. Fitzgerald hadn't made the connection until he'd pulled the files that morning. 18 months ago, Patricia Moreno, 31, vanished from the same general area, last seen heading toward Sahaley Arm. They'd found her camera bag near Doubtful Lake, lens cap still on. 6 months after that, Derek Cunningham, 43, disappeared during a dawn summit attempt. His climbing gear was discovered neatly coiled at 6,200 feet, carabiner still racked. And 4 months back, Ashley Park, 29, failed to return from a solo backpacking trip. Her tent had been found fully pitched at a backcountry site, sleeping bag spread out, food hung properly in a bare canister. She'd even left her journal, final entry dated to the morning she'd gone missing. Slept terribly, dreamed of being hungry, so hungry. Woke up starving even after breakfast. 4 people, 4 impossible disappearances, all clustered within a 6-mile radius, all in late September or October, all during temperature drops that shouldn't have been possible given the recorded weather data. Fitzgerald pulled out the case files he'd photocopied against protocol. He'd laid them side by side on his kitchen table the night before, looking for patterns. The disappearances shared characteristics that made his analytical mind itch. Complete lack of evidence suggesting voluntary departure, personal items abandoned in ways that suggested interruption rather than panic, and This was the detail that had kept him up until 300. Every victim's final known photograph showed them smiling, not the strained grimace of exhaustion or the performance smile for social media. Genuine, almost euphoric expressions. He'd started making phone calls. Patricia Moreno's sister described her as cautious to the point of paranoia, someone who triple-checked her gear and never took unnecessary risks. Derek Cunningham's climbing partner said he'd been uncharacteristically reckless the week before vanishing, talking about finally feeling free and not being hungry anymore. Ashley Park's roommate mentioned she'd lost 15 pounds in the month before her trip despite eating constantly, complaining that nothing satisfied her. The behavioral shifts bothered Fitzgerald more than the disappearances themselves. People didn't just vanish in the Cascades. The terrain was harsh but navigable. The weather predictable enough for preparation. But people didn't typically undergo personality changes before hiking into oblivion either. He'd tried presenting his findings to Superintendent Morrison that morning. Morrison had listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a subordinate, then reminded Fitzgerald that coincidence existed, that the park saw 200 search and rescue operations annually. That pattern recognition was the human brain's specialty, even when no pattern existed. "You're good at your job because you're thorough," Morrison had said, walking him toward the door. "But sometimes people just make bad decisions. Wrong turn, sudden weather, underlying medical condition. We document, we search, we move on." Fitzgerald had nodded, taken his maps and case files, and driven straight to the Cascade Pass trailhead. Morrison was wrong. This wasn't coincidence. This was something with a methodology. The trail climbed through old-growth forest, Douglas fir and western hemlock forming a canopy that reduced the morning to green twilight. Fitzgerald maintained a steady pace, pausing every quarter mile to mark his GPS coordinates and take compass bearings. The numbers continued their impossible behavior. His altimeter claimed he'd ascended 200 feet in the first mile, but the trail grade clearly didn't support that elevation gain. He stopped at mile 1.8, where the forest opened briefly onto a rocky outcrop. Below, the Stehekin River Valley spread out in autumn colors, ridgelines sharp against cloudless sky. According to his topographical map, he should be at 4,100 feet. His GPS read 4,100 feet. His altimeter read 5,300 feet. His handheld barometer suggested 3,800 feet. Fitzgerald sat on a granite shelf and pulled out his thermos. The coffee had gone lukewarm, despite the insulated container. He sipped it anyway, watching the tree line across the valley. Something about the forest felt attentive, as if the landscape were holding its breath. His radio crackled. He'd left it on out of habit despite knowing he was beyond reliable range. Static washed through, then a sound that might have been words. He adjusted the frequency, trying to clear the signal. More static, and underneath it, something rhythmic, almost like breathing. "Base, this is Fitzgerald, radio check." He kept his voice level, professional. The static shifted, and for just a moment he heard it clearly, syllables in a language he didn't recognize, guttural and wet, as if the speaker's mouth were full. He switched the radio off. Equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, perfectly rational explanations that didn't account for why his hands had started trembling. The temperature had dropped. He checked his thermometer, 41 degrees. It had been 53 when he'd started hiking 40 minutes ago. October in the Cascades could be unpredictable, but a 12-degree drop in less than an hour suggested a front moving in. He scanned the sky, still clear, no clouds massing over the peaks. He continued upward. The trail switchbacked through stands of mountain hemlock, trees twisted by winter wind into shapes that suggested anguish. Fitzgerald had hiked this route dozens of times, knew every landmark, but today the forest felt subtly rearranged, as if someone had shifted each tree 3 feet to the left while maintaining the overall pattern. At mile 3.7, he found the rock where Jordan Hayes' backpack had been recovered. The stone was flat and convenient, exactly where someone would naturally set down a load. Fitzgerald circled it slowly, examining the ground. The search team would have contaminated the immediate area, but he was looking for older signs. He found them 8 feet west, depressions in the duff that could have been footprints. Large ones, barefoot, the toes splayed in a way that suggested running. Not toward the trail, away from it, heading straight into the dense forest where no sane hiker would venture. Fitzgerald photographed them with his digital camera, including a ruler for scale. The prints measured 13 inches long, 4 inches wide at the ball. Possible for an exceptionally tall person, but the stride length between prints suggested something moving fast enough that Fitzgerald's educated guess put the speed at 20 miles per hour. Impossible on this terrain. Suicidal in bare feet. He followed the prints into the trees. They continued for 30 yards, then stopped abruptly at the base of a massive cedar. Not faded or obscured, just stopped, as if whatever made them had stepped to this exact spot and ceased to exist. Fitzgerald looked up. The cedar rose 80 feet, its lowest branches 40 feet above ground. Nothing could climb that first section without equipment, and there were no marks suggesting harness damage or rope burns. He stepped back, considering possibilities. Someone could have walked backward in their own prints, but the gait showed forward momentum, not the careful placement of someone reversing. An animal could have obscured the continuation, but the surrounding ground showed no disturbance. He photographed everything, taking measurements, recording observations in his field notebook with mechanical precision. When he turned to head back to the trail, he realized he couldn't see it. The forest had closed around him like water filling a hole. His compass pointed north. The trail ran east-west. He walked north anyway, trusting the instrument, and emerged onto the path after 40 yards of bushwhacking. According to his watch, he'd been off trail for 6 minutes. According to the sun's position, it had been closer to 20. The cold was becoming aggressive now. Fitzgerald pulled on his fleece layer and checked his thermometer again. 34 degrees. He'd hiked through worse, but the rate of change violated everything he understood about weather patterns. Cold fronts didn't descend like guillotines. He continued upward, watching his instruments spin their contradictory data. The trail reached Cascade Pass at mile 4.9. His GPS claimed he'd covered 6.2 miles. His pedometer agreed with the GPS. His eyes agreed with the mile markers. The pass opened onto alpine meadow, the peaks of the North Cascades spreading in all directions like broken teeth. Fitzgerald had always found the view humbling, a reminder of how thoroughly nature dwarfed human concerns. Today, it felt hostile. He found the survey marker where Jordan Hayes had taken his final photograph. The stone was wind-scoured and ancient, carved with elevation data that matched none of his instruments. He sat beside it, eating an energy bar that tasted like cardboard, and tried to formulate a working theory. 4 disappearances, mathematical impossibilities, temperature anomalies, behavioral changes suggesting, what? Psychological break? Shared delusion? Environmental toxin? His training said to work with what he could measure. The temperature was dropping at roughly 6 degrees per hour. At this rate, it would hit 0 by late afternoon. He needed to summit Sahaley Arm, check the areas where Patricia Moreno and Derek Cunningham had vanished, and return before dark. Straightforward plan. Achievable objectives. The trail to Sahaley Arm climbed through boulder fields and permanent snowpack. Fitzgerald's boots found purchase on ice that shouldn't have formed yet, not this early in the season. The wind picked up carrying a smell he couldn't identify, something organic but wrong, like meat that had been frozen and thawed too many times. He reached the arm at 14:45 hours. The elevation marker read 7,200 feet. His instruments offered 11 different measurements, none matching. Patricia Moreno's camera bag had been found near a cairn marking the route to Sahaley Glacier. Fitzgerald approached it slowly, studying the ground. More prints, these ones smaller but showing the same splayed toes, the same impossible stride length. They led toward the glacier's terminal moraine, disappearing into a crevasse field that would kill anyone foolish enough to enter without ropes and ice axes. He stood at the edge looking down into blue ice. The crevasse dropped 40 feet to a floor of compacted snow and rock. Something dark lay at the bottom, fabric maybe, or a shadow that didn't match the sun's angle. Fitzgerald pulled out his climbing rope and anchored it to the cairn. This violated every safety protocol in the book. Solo glacier travel, no backup, no one knowing his location. But that dark shape needed identification, and he was the only person who seemed to understand these disappearances formed a pattern. The descent took 12 minutes. The crevasse walls pressed close enough to touch on both sides, ice gleaming with an oily sheen. The temperature inside felt 20 degrees warmer than the surface, the air humid and close. The dark shape resolved into fabric, a jacket, expensive technical gear in forest green. Patricia Moreno's sister had described her wearing that exact color. Fitzgerald knelt beside it, photographing from multiple angles before touching anything. The jacket lay spread-eagled, arms extended, as if someone had carefully removed it without disturbing its shape. No tears, no blood, no signs of the body that should have been inside it. Beneath the jacket, carved into the ice in letters 6 inches deep, were words in a language Fitzgerald didn't recognize. The characters looked like they'd been gouged by claws, each stroke deliberate and even. He photographed them, trying to capture the three-dimensional depth, the way they seemed to drink light. His breath came faster. The analytical part of his mind insisted on rational explanations. Someone had left the jacket, someone had carved the words, someone was staging an elaborate hoax. But his hands shook as he packed away his camera, and the explanations felt increasingly thin. He climbed back up to find the sun setting. Impossible. His watch showed 15-20 hours, too early for sunset by 2 hours at least. But the light was failing, the peaks going purple, and the temperature had hit 18 degrees. Fitzgerald started down the trail at a pace just shy of running. The numbers had stopped mattering, the instruments had become ornaments. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this mountain, and darkness was coming too fast. The forest greeted him like a mouth. Trees that had seemed merely twisted in daylight now looked deliberately malformed, branches reaching with purposeful hunger. The trail beneath his boots felt soft, almost organic, as if he were walking on something that had skin. At mile marker 2-1, he heard the voice. It came from his left, from deep in the trees where no trail existed. A man's voice calling for help in a tone that suggested minor inconvenience rather than emergency. "Hey, over here. I think I turned my ankle. Could use a hand." Fitzgerald stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, but protocol required response to distress calls. He turned toward the voice, playing his flashlight beam through the trees. "Where are you?" "Just past these hemlocks." "God, I'm so stupid. Wasn't watching where I stepped." The voice sounded closer now, but Fitzgerald's light showed nothing but trees and shadow. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to you." He moved into the forest, sweeping his light methodically. The voice continued, maintaining its casual, embarrassed tone. "Really appreciate this. Been calling for like an hour. Thought I was going to have to spend the night." Something about the phrasing caught Fitzgerald's attention. "What's your name?" Silence. Then, in a voice identical to his own, "Robert Fitzgerald. Really appreciate this." He ran. Not back to the trail. He couldn't remember which direction that was. Just away from the voice that wore his name. Branches caught his jacket, his pack, his face. He stumbled over roots that felt like fingers, pushed through undergrowth that seemed to actively resist. The voice followed, sometimes behind him, sometimes ahead, sometimes speaking in his voice, sometimes in Jordan Hayes's voice from the dead phone, sometimes in languages that predated English by centuries. It described hunger. Not poetic metaphor hunger, actual physical descriptions of tissue breaking down, organs consuming themselves, the body becoming a furnace that could never find sufficient fuel. Fitzgerald crashed through a final wall of brush and found himself on the trail. He knew this section, mile marker 1.4, the granite outcrop where he'd stopped that morning. Except the outcrop looked different now. The rock face carved with the same symbols he'd seen in the crevasse. His light caught movement at the tree line. A figure standing perfectly still watching him. Tall, 7 feet at least, but wrong in ways Fitzgerald's brain refused to process. The proportions suggested human, but the angles were sharper, the limbs too long, the fingers too many. It smiled. Fitzgerald saw teeth like railroad spikes, yellow-white in the flashlight beam, too many teeth in too large a mouth. He understood then, in a moment of crystallization that felt like his mind cracking. The Algonquian stories weren't metaphor. The Wendigo wasn't myth. It was taxonomy. A documented species that his European-trained rational mind had categorized as folklore, because the alternative meant rewriting everything he understood about reality. The thing moved, not walked, moved, covering 30 yards in a motion too fast for Fitzgerald's eyes to track. It stood in front of him now, close enough that he could smell it. That frozen meat stench multiplied by a factor of 10. Its breath came in white plumes despite the air being too cold for condensation. It spoke in a voice like grinding ice. Kiwi, kiwe win. The word meant nothing to Fitzgerald, but his body understood it, every cell recognizing the sound of perfect hunger given speech. The Wendigo reached out with hands that had too many joints. Its fingers touched Fitzgerald's chest just above the heart, with impossible gentleness. The cold that radiated from that touch went beyond temperature. It was the cold of absolute absence, of spaces between stars, of the void at the bottom of forever. Fitzgerald felt it enter him, not physically. The thing made no wound, drew no blood, but he felt it nonetheless, spreading through his chest cavity like ice crystals forming in supersaturated water. It moved into his stomach, his intestines, his throat, filling him with hunger so absolute that his last meal might as well have been months ago. He understood now what had happened to the others. They hadn't been taken, they'd been transformed. The personality changes, the final smiles, the abandoned gear, all signs of the Wendigo working inside them, hollowing them out, preparing them for what came next. The creature released him and stepped back. It gestured toward the forest with one too long arm, the movement somehow conveying invitation, promise, terrible freedom. Fitzgerald felt his legs move without consulting his brain. He walked toward the trees, his analytical mind screaming warnings that his body ignored. The hunger was everything now. It filled him from throat to groin, a physical sensation so overwhelming it left room for nothing else. Not fear, not reason, not even the survival instinct that had kept his species alive for millennia. He thought of food, not energy bars and freeze-dried meals. Real food. Meat. Living meat. Prey. The Wendigo walked beside him now, matching his pace through the forest. It spoke in that grinding voice, and though Fitzgerald didn't understand the words, he understood their meaning. This is what you've always been. This is what civilization teaches you to deny. This is the truth underneath the human lie. They walked for hours or minutes. Time had become as negotiable as distance. The forest opened into clearings that shouldn't exist, showed him vistas of valleys he'd never seen despite 12 years working this park. He saw the others. Patricia Moreno standing waist-deep in Doubtful Lake, the water around her thrashing with fish too frightened to flee fast enough. Derek Cunningham at 6,200 feet, methodically tracking a mountain goat that had no chance of escape. Ashley Park in her perfectly pitched tent, her journal open to entries she'd written after her official last one, describing the beauty of surrender. And Jordan Hayes at Cascade Pass, his phone abandoned because he no longer needed to document experiences for other people. His backpack abandoned because he no longer needed supplies. Everything he'd been abandoned because the Wendigo had given him something better. They were all still here. All still hunting, transformed into things that looked almost human if you didn't look too closely at the angles of their joints or the number of their teeth. They saw Fitzgerald and recognized him, waving with too many fingers, welcoming him to the family. The Wendigo brought him to a cave mouth he'd never seen, despite knowing every geological feature in this sector. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols identical to those he'd photographed, not carved, grown as if the rock itself had learned language. The creature gestured, and Fitzgerald understood. This is where you leave it behind. Everything that makes you human, everything that makes you weak, the cold, the fear, the small hungry ghost inside you that civilization calls conscience. He thought of Morrison telling him to move on. He thought of his apartment where he ate frozen dinners and watched nature documentaries about places he could visit but never truly inhabit. He thought of his ex-wife who'd left because he loved the wilderness more than her, which had been true, except he'd never loved it properly because he'd always maintained that final separation, that thin membrane of civilization that kept him from really entering the wild. The Wendigo offered to dissolve that membrane, to make him part of the forest in a way no human had been in centuries, to end the hunger by making it permanent, transforming it from absence into identity. His rational mind made one final effort. This is hypothermia. You're dying. Your brain is misfiring, creating hallucinations to explain your descent into fatal cold. Get back to the trail. Call for help. Follow protocol. But protocol was a human invention, and he wasn't sure he qualified as human anymore. The hunger had eaten everything except itself. The Wendigo waited. Patient. Eternal. It had all the time death allowed, which meant all the time in the world. Fitzgerald felt himself stepping forward, crossing the threshold into the cave, leaving behind his name and his rank and his 12 years of service. The cold intensified, and somewhere in the distance he heard his radio crackling. Morrison's voice calling his designation, asking for location, receiving only static that might have been wind or might have been Fitzgerald laughing as the transformation completed and he learned what teeth felt like when they grew past the point where human jaws could contain them. The last rational part of him thought, I should warn them. Tell Morrison to close the park. Stop others from coming here. But that thought dissolved as the hunger clarified, becoming pure and clean and absolutely right. He didn't want to warn anyone. He wanted them to come. One by one, or in groups, it didn't matter. The Wendigo was patient, and so was he, and the forest had room for so many more. He walked deeper into the cave, the symbols on the walls pulsing with a light that came from somewhere behind reality. Behind him, the entrance faded, not closing but simply ceasing to be something that existed in the same space as trails and rangers and search parties. Fitzgerald's last human thought was the equation. 4 disappearances plus 1 equals 5. 5 plus the next hiker equals 6. The math finally made sense, a pattern he could understand and appreciate and help perpetuate. Then even that thought went quiet, and there was only hunger, perfect and eternal, and the forest welcoming him home. 3 weeks later, Superintendent Morrison stood at the Cascade Pass trailhead with a team from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Robert Fitzgerald's truck had been found unlocked, his personal effects untouched. The search had covered 40 square miles, employed thermal imaging and cadaver dogs, interviewed every park employee and regular visitor. They'd found nothing. Not his pack, not his radio, not a single sign he'd ever climbed that trail. Morrison held the case file, reading Fitzgerald's final entry from 3 weeks ago. 4 disappearances, suspicious patterns, mathematical anomalies. The FBI team leader had already dismissed it as stress-induced paranoia, suggested Fitzgerald had experienced a breakdown and wandered off to die privately. But Morrison had worked with Fitzgerald for 8 years. The man didn't break. He documented, analyzed, and solved problems. If he'd seen a pattern, there was a pattern. Morrison looked up at the trail, watching the forest breathe in the November wind. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, far too fast for normal weather. His radio crackled with static that almost sounded like words in a language he didn't recognize. He thought about closing the park for the season. But the permits were already issued, the holiday hiking season was approaching, and the Forest Service had quotas to meet. Besides, Morrison told himself, coincidence existed. Sometimes people just made bad decisions. He climbed into his truck and drove back to the ranger station, and behind him the forest settled into watchful patience, and the Wendigo smiled with Robert Fitzgerald's teeth, and the hunger grew. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The smell reached William Archer before anything else. Decay mixed with something chemical, artificial, wrong for these woods. Mile marker 12 on the Cascade Pass Trail, elevation 5,400 feet, and nothing should smell like burning plastic and rotting meat combined. He stopped, one hand rising instinctively to cover his nose and mouth, the other dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt. The morning sun filtered through the Douglas firs in shafts of gold. everything looking exactly as it should except for that smell. 3 years ago, William would have radioed it in immediately, followed protocol, waited for backup. 3 years ago, he hadn't watched his partner fall into a crevasse while William held onto a rope that snapped like thread. 3 years ago, he still believed following the rules kept people safe. He keyed his radio anyway. The Motorola MT2000 crackled with static, which wasn't unusual this deep in the North Cascades. What was unusual was the way the static seemed to pulse, almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. Ranger Archer to base. I'm at mile 12 investigating an odor, requesting status update on the Garcia search. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No birds. He realized that now. The forest had gone completely silent. The static continued for 5 seconds, 10. Then a voice broke through, distant and warped. Base to Archer. No sign of Madison Garcia. Last known position was Doubtful Lake 3 days ago. Weather window closing. You're authorized for one more sweep before recall. One more sweep. Translation: give up, come back, write the report. Add another name to the list of people who walked into these mountains and never walked out. William had read the file a dozen times. Madison Garcia, 28, experienced hiker, proper equipment, filed an itinerary. She'd planned to summit Sahal Peak via the Cascade Pass Trail, then loop back through the Boston Basin. Standard route, well marked. She should have been back Monday. Today was Thursday. The smell grew stronger as he continued up the trail. His GPS unit, a Garmin E-Trex that was already obsolete but still more reliable than the newer models, showed him approaching the coordinates where Madison's tent had been found. Found, but not occupied. Found with all her gear still inside, sleeping bag unzipped, boots sitting neatly by the entrance. Found with deep gouges in the surrounding trees, marks that looked like claw marks except they were 8 feet off the ground. The search and rescue team had photographed everything, bagged what they could, then pulled back when the weather turned. Standard procedure. Sensible. Safe. William pushed through a stand of mountain hemlock and stopped. The tent was exactly where the report said it would be, bright orange against the green and gray of the wilderness, perched on a flat spot 30 yards from the trail. But the tent wasn't what made William's breath catch in his throat. Someone had built a circle around it, not rocks, bones. Dozens of them, ranging from small, rabbits, marmots, to large, deer femurs, elk ribs, and in the center, barely visible beneath a layer of pine needles, something that might have been a human skull before animals got to it. The bones had been placed deliberately, almost ritualistically, forming a perfect circle roughly 15 feet in diameter with the tent as its center. The SAR report hadn't mentioned this. No photographs, no documentation, which meant either they'd missed it, unlikely, or someone had built this circle in the last 36 hours. Or something had. William approached slowly, careful not to disturb the bone circle. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet rot mixing with that chemical taint. He pulled a bandana from his pack, tied it over his nose and mouth. It barely helped. The tent's entrance faced east, toward the rising sun and Sahal Peak. William crouched, playing his mag light across the interior. Sleeping bag, backpack, water bottles, camp stove. Everything exactly as described. He reached in, pulled out the backpack. Madison's wallet was inside, driver's license showing a smiling woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Her phone was there too, but the battery was dead. He was reaching for her journal when he heard it. A voice. Distant. Female. Help. William spun, scanning the forest. Madison? Madison Garcia? Nothing. Just that oppressive silence, heavy as snowfall. Madison, if you can hear me, I'm Ranger Archer. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me where you are? The silence stretched. William counted his own heartbeats, trying to slow his breathing. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, upslope toward Sahali Arm. Please. So cold. William grabbed his radio. Base, this is Archer. I have possible contact with Madison Garcia, north of her last known position, moving toward Sahali Arm. Pursuing. Static. Then after a long pause. Archer. Weather system moving in fast. You need to extract now. I have audio contact with the missing person. Archer, look at your sky. William looked up. The morning's clear blue had turned gray. Clouds moving in from the west with unnatural speed. In the North Cascades, weather could kill faster than exposure. But somewhere up ahead was a woman who'd been missing for 3 days. A woman who was cold, who needed help. A woman who shouldn't be able to walk, not after 3 days without food or water in these conditions. Acknowledged, William said into the radio. Proceeding with caution. Will extract with subject or return within 2 hours. He didn't wait for a response. He marked the tent's location on his GPS, took 3 photographs with his digital camera, one of the bone circle, one of the tent, one of the surrounding area, and started up the slope. The voice called again, clearer now. Help me, please. The trees grew thinner as he climbed, subalpine firs giving way to scattered white bark pines. The smell faded, but didn't disappear, replaced by something else. A cold that shouldn't exist in late July. His breath began to mist. The temperature had been 65 degrees at the tent. Now it felt like 40, maybe less. William zipped up his jacket, pulled on gloves. His training said this was wrong, said cold spots in summer meant weather systems, said proceed with extreme caution. But his training hadn't prepared him for the bone circle. His training hadn't explained the smell. His training hadn't accounted for the fact that Madison Garcia's voice sounded exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. Not weaker, not strained, just mechanically calling for help. The trail, what remained of it, curved around a massive boulder. William paused, listening. The voice had stopped. In the new silence, he could hear his own pulse, too fast, hammering against his ribs. 3 years ago in the Olympic Mountains, he'd heard his partner's voice for 2 hours after watching him fall, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had seen. Grief did strange things. Trauma did stranger ones. But grief didn't build bone circles. He rounded the boulder and found the first body. Not Madison. Too old. The clothing had rotted to fragments, bones scattered by scavengers, but enough remained to identify it as human. Male, based on the bone structure. The skull had been cracked open and inside. William's stomach lurched. He turned away, swallowing bile. Inside the skull cavity, something had nested. Not birds. The remains were too organized, too deliberate. Small bones arranged in patterns. Teeth. Dozens of teeth, human and animal mixed together, creating a mandala of horror. He forced himself to document it. 3 photos, GPS coordinates, notes in his weatherproof pad with hands that shook despite the gloves. This was a crime scene. Multiple crime scenes. This was... Help me. The voice came from directly ahead, maybe 50 yards. William looked up from his notes. A woman stood at the edge of the tree line. She was naked, her skin gray-white, her hair hanging in matted clumps. Too far to see her face clearly, but the body type matched Madison's description. 5'6", athletic build. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, not shivering despite the cold. Madison? William called. Madison Garcia? She didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there. And William felt something in his chest go cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He started forward. Training said wrap her in emergency blankets, assess for hypothermia, get her down the mountain. Training said she was in shock, said trauma could make people behave strangely. Training said a lot of things. Training didn't explain why she wasn't shivering. 20 yards away now, close enough to see that her skin wasn't just pale. It was wrong. Mottled, close enough to see the way her joints bent at angles that weren't quite right. Close enough to see that she wasn't breathing, her chest completely still. 10 yards. She smiled. Her teeth were gone. All of them. The mouth that stretched across her face showed only raw gums and something moving inside, something dark and writhing. William stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He'd seen death before. He'd pulled bodies from rivers, from crevasses, from beneath avalanche debris. He knew what dead looked like. This wasn't dead. This was something else. "Madison," he said, and his voice came out steady somehow, professional. "I need you to tell me if you're hurt." The thing wearing Madison's body tilted its head, bird-like, curious. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not from that ruined mouth. "Hungry?" Then it charged. William had maybe 2 seconds to react. He grabbed the bear spray, aimed, fired. The orange cloud caught the thing mid-stride. It didn't stop. Didn't even slow. Just kept coming, arms outstretched, those wrong joints bending and flexing. He ran. Down the slope, crashing through undergrowth, his boots slipping on loose rock. Behind him he could hear it following. Not running exactly. The sounds were wrong. Too many footfalls. Too heavy. Like something massive was moving through the forest, not a woman's body. William's radio bounced against his hip, useless. His GPS beeped warnings about elevation loss, about straying from marked trails. He ignored all of it, focused only on not falling, on putting distance between himself and that thing. The forest opened ahead. He recognized the area, Horseshoe Basin, a glacial cirque about a mile from where he'd left the bone circle. No, that wasn't right. Horseshoe Basin was 3 miles from the tent, and he'd only climbed maybe half a mile. The distances were wrong. The geography was wrong. He burst into the clearing and stopped. 7 bodies hung from the trees. Not recent, weeks old, maybe months. They'd been opened from throat to groin, emptied out, the skin pulled tight over hollow frames. They swayed in a wind William couldn't feel, creating a sound like wind chimes, bone clicking against bone, and carved into every tree, repeated hundreds of times in symbols that hurt to look at directly, was the same word in what William recognized as Cree, Wendigo. He knew the legends. Every ranger in the Pacific Northwest knew them, stories passed down from native tribes, warnings about the winter that walked, the hunger that consumed. Creatures born from cannibalism and greed, forever starving, forever hunting. The Algonquian peoples had names for it: Wendigo, Widico, Widico. They'd had ceremonies to prevent it, rituals to drive it away. They'd had sense enough to fear it. Behind William, the sounds had stopped. He turned slowly. Madison stood at the edge of the clearing. But she'd changed. Grown. The body was longer now, stretched, the arms reaching almost to the ground. Antlers had sprouted from her skull, massive and bleached white. Her skin had taken on the texture of birch bark, peeling and raw. And she was still smiling. "You smell like guilt," she said, and the voice bypassed his ears entirely, speaking directly into his skull. Like failure, like rope that snaps, like watching someone fall and never hit bottom. William's breath caught. "You're not real. I'm the realest thing you've ever known. I'm the hunger that lives in the space between heartbeats. I'm the cold that claims the lost. I'm what waits at the end of all wandering." More figures emerged from the forest, the 7 bodies from the trees, still empty, still hollow, walking with the jerky movements of puppets. And others. Hikers, climbers, people who disappeared into these mountains over years, decades. All wearing the same wrong smile, all moving with that same terrible purpose. William pulled his radio. "Base, this is Archer. I need immediate evac, grid reference." He looked at his GPS. The screen showed only static, numbers cycling randomly. "I'm in Horseshoe Basin. I have multiple fatalities. The radio crackled. Through the static he heard his own voice. "I'm in Horseshoe Basin. I have multiple fatalities." Then his partner's voice, distant, echoing up from 3 years past. "The rope is slipping. William, the rope." He dropped the radio like it had burned him. "Guilt is delicious," the Wendigo said, taking a step forward. "It seasons the meat, makes the feast so much sweeter. Did you know that? Did you know you've been marinating in it for 3 years, making yourself perfect for consumption? Stay back." William's hand found his service weapon, a Glock 22 that felt absurdly inadequate. "I'm warning you. You can't kill hunger. You can't shoot cold, but please, try. The struggle makes you taste better. The empty bodies moved closer, forming a circle. William recognized faces from missing persons reports he'd read, cases that had gone cold. 30 years of disappearances, all standing here, all wearing that same terrible smile. He'd read about the Wendigo in college, in an anthropology elective he'd taken to fill credits. The professor had explained the psychological interpretation, that Wendigo psychosis was a culture-bound syndrome, a manifestation of starvation anxiety, that the monster was metaphor, not reality. The professor had been wrong. William fired. 3 shots, center mass. The bullets passed through the Wendigo without effect, punching holes that closed immediately, bark skin knitting back together. Iron and lead, it said, laughing. Such human solutions. Try this instead. It gestured, and William's gun grew suddenly hot, metal glowing red. He dropped it, watching it melt into slag on the rocks. The bones around the tent, William said, buying time, looking for any escape. That was a warning, wasn't it? A boundary. The bones were an invitation. They always are. We leave them for the guilty ones, the ones who reek of failure and shame. They can't help themselves. They always cross the circle. They always come looking. Madison Garcia, the real one. Where is she? Gone. Consumed. Her meat fed the hunger for almost 2 days. Her guilt, she hit a pedestrian once, did you know? Teenage boy, not her fault. He ran into the street, but she never forgave herself. Her guilt was exquisite, almost as good as yours. William's mind raced. The legends had variations, but most agreed on certain points. The Wendigo feared fire. It avoided sacred spaces. It could be driven away by shamans, by those who knew the old ceremonies. William was not a shaman. He had a maglite, 2 energy bars, and a lifetime of guilt. Your partner, the Wendigo said, circling now, the empty bodies moving with it. Thomas Whitfield, age 34, father of 2. You held the rope. You felt it slip. You could have let go, saved yourself. But you held on, didn't you? Until your hands bled, until the fibers snapped. Not your fault, everyone said. Equipment failure, the report said. But you know better. Shut up. You know you held on too long. That if you'd released sooner, the rope wouldn't have snapped, wouldn't have sent him tumbling into that crevasse. You tried to be a hero. You made it worse. Shut up. And now you're here, looking for another lost soul, trying to save someone, trying to rewrite history. But you can't save anyone, William Archer. You can only join them. The empty bodies rushed forward as one. William didn't think. He grabbed his pack, pulled out his camp stove fuel canister, and hurled it at the nearest corpse. Then he aimed his maglite, modified years ago with a high-intensity LED, directly at the canister and prayed. The concentrated beam hit the metal, and whether through luck or physics, something sparked. The fuel canister exploded in a ball of orange flame that engulfed 3 of the bodies. They shrieked, a sound like wind tearing through broken windows, and stumbled backward. The fire caught on their desiccated skin, spreading fast. They writhed, collapsed, and didn't rise again. The Wendigo screamed, and the sound shook snow from distant peaks. Fire, it hissed. Old weapon, good weapon, but you have so little of it. William had already pulled out his second canister, his last one. His hand shook as he armed it, ready to throw. You can maybe burn 4 more, the Wendigo said. Maybe. That leaves 11, and I am so very hungry. It was right. William looked at the circle of bodies, at the massive antlered thing that had been Madison, at the forest that seemed to go on forever in all directions. He was going to die here. He'd known it from the moment he'd crossed that bone circle, maybe even from the moment he'd volunteered for this search. 3 years running from guilt, and it had finally caught him. But maybe. The thought came suddenly, desperately. The professor had been wrong about the Wendigo being metaphor. But he'd been right about one thing. It was born from guilt and hunger. It fed on shame. What if you stopped feeding it? You want to know something? William said, and was surprised to find his voice steady. About Thomas, about the rope. The Wendigo paused, interested. I did hold on too long. You're right about that, but not because I was trying to be a hero. William took a breath, felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years. I held on because I was terrified, because letting go meant accepting he was gone. I wasn't trying to save him. I was trying to save myself from having to face it. The circle of bodies had stopped advancing, and the SAR report was bullshit. Everyone knew it. The rope didn't fail because of a defect. It failed because we were using old equipment, because budget cuts meant we were making do, because I certified that rope myself, even though it was past inspection. I killed him with negligence, with laziness, with not wanting to fill out the paperwork for new gear. The Wendigo tilted its massive head. But here's the thing, William continued, and he felt tears on his face, hot against the unnatural cold. I've spent 3 years believing I could fix it, that if I saved enough people, found enough lost hikers, ran enough searches, it would somehow balance the scales, that I could earn forgiveness. He looked up at the thing that wore Madison's stretched skin. I was wrong. There is no fixing it. Thomas is dead. Madison is dead. And all the searches in the world won't change that. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone trying to outrun his own guilt. And I'm tired of running. The Wendigo stared at him for a long moment. Then it laughed. You think confession matters? You think acknowledgement changes anything? The hunger is eternal. The cold is absolute. You are still meat. But something had shifted. The circle of bodies looked less solid somehow, their outlines blurring. The cold had lessened by maybe 1 degree. You're right, William said. I'm meat. I'm mortal. I'm fallible. I'm all the things humans are, but I'm done being paralyzed by it. He raised the fuel canister. Come and get me. The Wendigo lunged. William threw the canister directly at its chest, then dove and grabbed his melted gun. Still hot, but cooling. The metal seared his palm, but he gripped it anyway, used the slag as a crude projectile, hurled it at the canister. The explosion was massive, fuel and fire and heat washing over the clearing. The Wendigo shrieked, its bark skin blazing. The empty bodies scattered like leaves in a hurricane. William didn't wait to see the result. He ran, using the confusion to break the circle, heading downslope toward where he prayed the tent still existed, where Madison's GPS had last registered a location, where reality might still have some purchase. Behind him, the forest screamed. Trees cracked and fell. The temperature plummeted and surged, ice and fire at war. William ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed in a heap of pine needles and exhaustion. When he finally looked up, he was lying next to the orange tent, the bone circle still intact around it. The clearing was empty, silent. The smell was gone. The cold had retreated. Morning sun filtered through the trees exactly as it should, and somewhere distant he could hear birds singing. His radio crackled. Archer, this is base. You're 2 hours overdue. What's your status? William stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he keyed the mic. Base, this is Archer. I've completed the search. Madison Garcia is deceased. Multiple other fatalities discovered. Requesting immediate support and body recovery team. Grid reference follows. He rattled off the coordinates, then sat back against a tree. His hand throbbed where the melted gun had burned him, the pain sharp and real and grounding. 3 days later, the recovery team had cataloged 14 bodies, some dating back 30 years. Madison Garcia's remains were found 300 yards from her tent. Cause of death officially listed as exposure, though the medical examiner noted unusual tissue damage consistent with scavenging predator species unknown. They never found the Wendigo. The bone circle was photographed, documented, then scattered. The symbols carved into the trees were attributed to vandalism, possibly by the same person or persons responsible for the deaths, though no evidence of foul play was ever established. William Archer returned to duty after 2 weeks of mandatory counseling. He continued working SAR operations, continued finding the lost and bringing them home when he could. But he stopped believing it would fix anything. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees just right, he heard a voice calling, hungry, cold, waiting. On those nights, William made sure his doors were locked, his windows sealed. He kept a fire burning in the hearth until dawn, and he never ever volunteered for searches in the North Cascades again. The hunger is eternal, the cold is absolute, and some lost things should stay lost. But William Archer was done being paralyzed by guilt. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't fix the past, but he could keep walking forward one day at a time, bearing his failures like scars instead of chains. The Wendigo would be waiting. It always was. But maybe, just maybe, William had stopped being the perfect meal. Maybe that was enough. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Andrew Clark had analyzed 12 years of wildlife migration data, and none of it explained why 47 deer carcasses formed a perfect spiral around the frozen lake. Each one faced inward, each one missing only the liver. He knelt beside the nearest specimen, his breath forming clouds in the January air that immediately crystallized and fell like tiny glass shards. The thermometer on his pack read -23 Fahrenheit, but the wind chill dragged it somewhere closer to -40. His fingers, even through 2 layers of gloves, felt wooden as he documented the scene with his camera. The deer's ribcage had been opened with surgical precision, spread wide like butterfly wings. No tearing, no gnawing. Just clean separation of bone and cartilage that spoke of either incredible strength or impossible patience. "Clark, you getting this?" The voice crackled through his radio, thin and distant. Sarah from base camp, 15 miles south across terrain that had taken him 6 hours to traverse on snowshoes. "Documenting now," he said, his jaw tight with cold. "Patterns consistent across all visible specimens. Spiral formation approximately 200 meters in diameter. No tracks approaching or leaving the kill sites." "Say again? No tracks?" Andrew stood, his knees protesting, and swept his gaze across the pristine snow. The wind had scoured the lake's surface into a mirror of ice, but the surrounding forest floor should have shown something. Wolves, bears, though none should be active in this cold. Even birds would leave marks. But the snow around each carcass remained unbroken except for his own intrusion, a line of holes punched by his snowshoes that looked obscene in their singularity. Negative on tracks, wind might have covered them, but given the shelter of the tree line, he let the sentence die. Sarah knew the implications. They both did. He'd been with the Forest Service for 8 years, held a master's in wildlife biology from the University of Minnesota, and had never encountered anything that violated basic ecological principles this thoroughly. "Could be a helicopter drop," Sarah offered, her tone suggesting she didn't believe it. "Some kind of sick joke? In -40 wind chill? Into a wilderness area with no landing zones for 30 miles? Andrew moved to the next carcass, his headlamp cutting a cone of white through the gathering dusk. 4:30 in the afternoon, and the light already dying, swallowed by the endless pine forest that pressed against the lake's edge like a living wall. Besides, the bodies show no impact trauma. They were killed here. He didn't add the other detail, the one that had made his breakfast coffee want to climb back up his throat. Each deer's eyes remained open, frozen in the instant of death, and every single pair tracked the same direction. Toward the center of the spiral, where the ice was darkest and the snow had been disturbed in a pattern he couldn't quite parse. Not footprints exactly, more like something had been dragged in circles over and over until the surface became a mandala of compressed snow and shadow. "I'm losing your signal," Sarah said, her voice fracturing into static. "Clark? Andrew? Still here. Radios probably." The transmission dissolved into white noise that sounded just for a second like words in a language he didn't recognize. He adjusted the frequency, checked the battery. Full charge. The equipment was standard Motorola, rated for extreme cold, maintained according to protocol. It should work. It didn't. Andrew killed the radio and stood in the silence that rushed in to fill its absence. The wind had died. That should have been a relief, but instead it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. No birds called. No small animals rustled through the underbrush. Even the natural creaking of frozen wood had ceased, leaving only the sound of his own breathing, harsh and too loud in his ears. He'd come to investigate the report filed by a trapper named Jacob Coleman, who'd called in 3 days ago claiming to have seen something impossible near Lake Moira. The conversation, transcribed in the incident log, had been marked "wellness check required" because Coleman's statements had become increasingly incoherent. References to the hunger that walks and warnings about the cold that hunts that base camp had attributed to hypothermia or isolation psychosis. Coleman hadn't responded to radio contact since, and Andrew's secondary objective was to verify the man's status at his registered trap line 20 miles northwest. That objective now felt considerably more urgent. The center of the spiral drew him despite his better judgment. Andrew approached it the way he might approach a wounded predator, alert for any sign of movement, any indication that the scene might become active. The disturbed snow resolved into something more defined as he got closer. Symbols, he realized. Not random at all. Geometric patterns carved into the surface with enough force to reach the ice beneath, arranged in a circle within the circle. 7 points. 7 angles. Math that his brain recognized as significant even before he consciously registered why. A heptagram. He knew this from undergraduate anthropology, from the comparative religion elective he'd taken because he needed the humanities credit. 7-pointed star. Sacred geometry in multiple traditions, but the specific configuration, the way certain angles crossed, the orientation to true north, that was particular to something else, something he'd read in a paper about indigenous beliefs of the Great Lakes region. Andrew pulled out his notebook, the pages crackling with ice, and sketched the symbol with numb fingers. He'd photograph it too, document everything according to protocol, but the act of drawing forced him to observe the details, the depth of the carved lines, the way they seemed to pull at his vision, making him want to trace their paths with his eyes over and over until the pattern burned itself into his optic nerve. "Protective ward," he muttered, his voice seeming to die inches from his mouth, absorbed by the forest. Or summoning circle. Jesus. He didn't believe in that. Couldn't believe in it. His entire career was built on the foundation of observable phenomena, measurable data, cause and effect that could be tracked and analyzed. Deer died because of predation, disease, or starvation. They didn't arrange themselves in spirals around occult geometry. They didn't stare at the same point with their last breath, while something removed their livers without leaving tracks. The temperature dropped. Andrew felt it before his thermometer confirmed it. A plunge so sharp that his exposed skin went from painful to numb in seconds. -30, -35. The LCD display on his scientific gauge flickered, struggled, and then showed a reading that couldn't be right. -52. Nothing in the forecast had predicted this. The entire cold front had been supposed to moderate tonight, temperatures climbing back toward the teens. His breath no longer formed clouds. It crystallized instantly into particles that fell like snow, creating a small blizzard around his face with each exhalation. The trees began to crack, sharp reports like distant gunfire as the sap inside them froze and expanded. Andrew's survival training kicked in before his conscious mind could fully process the danger. This cold could kill him in minutes. Even with his gear, even with his experience, wind chill this extreme would overcome his body's ability to generate heat. He needed shelter, fire, needed to activate his emergency beacon, and the ice screamed, not cracked, not groaned. Screamed, a rising wail that seemed to contain multitudes of voices, all of them human, all of them expressing a hunger so vast and terrible that Andrew's knees buckled. He caught himself on his ski poles, the metal so cold it burned even through his gloves, and watched as the center of the spiral, the carved symbol, began to glow. No, not glow. The opposite of glow. The lines weren't emitting light. They were absorbing it, drinking in the last of the day's illumination and leaving only darkness so complete it seemed three-dimensional. A void that had depth and substance, that moved with something like breath, that whispered in that language he didn't know but somehow understood on a level below language, below thought, in the ancient part of his brain that remembered when humans were prey. Hungry, so hungry, never full, never warm. Andrew ran. His body made the decision before his mind could interfere with survival instinct, and he found himself crashing through the tree line with all the grace of a panicked animal. Branches whipped at his face. His snowshoes caught on buried logs, sending him sprawling twice into drifts deep enough to swallow him. Each time he hauled himself up and kept moving, driven by a terror so pure it felt like electricity in his veins. Behind him, the ice continued to scream, or maybe that was the wind returning. A gale that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, carrying voices that formed words he refused to comprehend. He'd dropped his headlamp somewhere, but enough twilight remained to navigate by. The forest a maze of black trunks and white snow that all looked identical. North. He needed to go north. Coleman's trapline was north, and if the man was still alive, still sane, maybe he'd have answers that Andrew's rational mind couldn't produce. The GPS on his belt showed his position as a blinking dot surrounded by contour lines, but the coordinates kept shifting, jumping back and forth as if he was teleporting hundreds of feet with each reading. Magnetic interference, some part of him noted. Deposits of iron ore in the bedrock were common in this region, could play havoc with navigation equipment. Except that explanation didn't account for the way the trees seemed to rearrange themselves, or how he kept coming back to the same frozen stream no matter which direction he turned. He'd been running for 20 minutes when he found the first trap. Steel jaw type. Illegal in Minnesota for decades but still occasionally used by those who didn't care about regulations. This one had been sprung, the jaws closed on nothing, and hung from its chain about 7 feet off the ground. Someone had lifted it and tied it there, looping the chain around a branch too high for any person to reach without a ladder. Andrew approached it slowly, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sent fresh cascades of ice crystals down his jacket. The trap's jaws were bent, warped out of alignment by force that must have been immense. Metal fatigue, his mind offered. Improper tensioning causing structural failure, but the marks on the steel looked like bite impressions, rows of indentations that were too large, too numerous, to belong to any animal he could name. "Coleman," he called, his voice hoarse. "Jacob Coleman, this is Ranger Clark. If you can hear me, respond." The forest swallowed his words and gave nothing back. Andrew pulled out his radio, tried again to raise base camp, but received only that same static that wasn't static, the underneath words that made his fillings ache and his vision blur at the edges. He was about to give up when a voice cut through the interference. I shouldn't have come. Male, shredded by fear and something else, something that sounded like starvation. "Can't stop eating, wanna stop, so cold." "Coleman, is that you? What's your location?" "Doesn't matter, already gone. It takes what it needs, liver first, always liver. That's where the soul lives, old ones knew. Warmth there, last warmth. But never enough." The transmission cut off with a sound like teeth gnashing. Andrew checked his GPS again, found the coordinates for Coleman's registered cabin marker, and forced himself toward it even though every instinct screamed to turn back, to retreat to base camp and let someone else handle whatever was happening here. But there was no one else. The boundary waters stretched across 1,000,000 acres of the most remote wilderness in the lower 48 states, and backup was hours away even in ideal conditions. If Coleman was injured, dying, or worse in ways that Andrew's training had never prepared him for, then he was the only chance the man had. The cabin materialized from the darkness, like something conjured rather than built. Single room, maybe 12 by 14, constructed from logs that were chinked with moss and mud. No smoke from the chimney pipe. No light in the single window. The door stood open, swinging slightly in a breeze that Andrew couldn't feel, and the snow in front of the threshold was stained dark, with something that had frozen into a slick, organic glass. "Federal Forest Service," Andrew announced, his hand moving to the bear spray on his belt even though he knew it would be useless in this cold. The propellant would barely function, and anything that could bend steel traps wouldn't care about capsaicin. "I'm coming in." The interior was worse than he'd imagined, but not in the way he'd expected. No gore, no signs of struggle. Just emptiness that felt aggressive in its totality. The cabin had been stripped of everything that made it habitable. Food stores gone, blankets gone, the small wood stove ripped from its housing and dragged toward the door, leaving gouges in the floor that looked like claw marks, and in the center of the room, carved into the wooden planks with the same precision as the symbol on the ice, was a message in letters 2 feet high. "Wendigo killed me 3 days ago, but I won't stop eating." Andrew's flashlight beam wavered as his hands began to shake. Not from cold, though, that remained a constant threat. From recognition. Wendigo. The proper Ojibwe term, not the bastardized Wendigo that had made it into popular culture. He knew this legend, had read the anthropological papers during his research on predator-prey relationships in the Great Lakes region. A spirit of endless hunger born from taboo, from cannibalism driven by starvation, that transformed its victims into creatures that could never be satisfied no matter how much they consumed. Cold incarnate, famine given teeth, folklore, cultural metaphor for the dangers of winter isolation and the collapse of social bonds under extreme conditions. Nothing more. Except that didn't explain the spiral of deer corpses, didn't explain the impossible temperature drop, or the geographic confusion that had him turned around in forest he knew like his own backyard. Didn't explain why his breath was now visible again, great plumes of steam that meant the air had warmed up to merely deadly rather than instantly lethal, or why that warming felt more ominous than the cold had been. Because if it was getting warmer, something was no longer in the area, something whose presence carried winter in its bones, something that was hunting elsewhere. The second message was carved into the wall beside the door, nearly invisible, until Andrew's light caught it at the right angle. "It walks where hunger walks. It is hunger." 7 days without food I held out. 8th day I ate. 9th day it ate me. Now I am it, and it is endless. Below the words, scratched with what looked like fingernails, was a drawing. Antlers, massive and malformed, sprouting from a skull that was too elongated to be human, but too human to be anything else. Skin stretched so tight that every bone showed in skeletal detail, ribs like barrel staves, joints swollen and wrong. The eyes, just circles gouged deep into the wood, somehow conveyed more madness than any artistic skill could have achieved. Andrew backed out of the cabin and vomited in the snow, his stomach emptying itself of the energy bar and coffee that were supposed to have sustained him through the day. The taste of bile was sharp and clean compared to the psychic residue of that drawing, the knowledge it represented. Coleman had killed himself with that message. Not physically, there was no body, but spiritually, mentally, in all the ways that mattered. The man had broken under the weight of something that Andrew's education insisted couldn't exist. The howl started low, and rose until it inhabited a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly in his chest cavity. Not a wolf, not any animal Andrew had ever heard, and he'd heard them all across 48 states of fieldwork. This was vocalization from a throat that should not be capable of producing sound, expelled from lungs that should not contain breath, expressing need that transcended biology and entered the realm of cosmic hunger. Pure want, pure absence, a black hole given voice. It was close. Andrew's training reasserted itself through the panic. He needed fire, needed shelter, needed to make it through the night because no rescue would come before dawn, and his emergency beacon would take hours to bring a response, even if it managed to get a signal through whatever was interfering with electronics. The cabin was out of the question, but there was a ridge line half a mile east where the geology created natural overhangs, places that could be fortified into defensible positions. He ran again, this time with purpose rather than panic, pacing himself to preserve energy and maintain awareness of his surroundings. The forest had changed. He noticed it gradually, details accumulating until they formed a picture too disturbing to dismiss. The trees were damaged, Great swathes of bark stripped away in vertical patterns too regular to be random. Branches broken at heights that should have been out of reach. And on several trunks, carved with the same precision as the symbols on the ice and cabin floor, were more words in a mixture of English and what had to be Ojibwe, Windigu Atusawin, Hunger Giweden, North Manitou Mashkiki, spirit medicine needed. Someone had been trying to leave warnings, Coleman probably in his last lucid moments before transformation or death or whatever had happened to him. Andrew photographed each one, his academic training demanding documentation even as his survival instinct screamed at him to keep moving. The words were a trail, he realized. Not random markings, but deliberate signposts leading where? North. Giweden. Everything pointed north toward the deepest wilderness, toward Lake Superior's frozen shore, toward territory so remote that even the trap lines didn't extend that far, toward whatever had to be stopped, contained, or at least understood before it migrated south into more populated regions. Andrew found the overhang just as the last light died. It was exactly as he remembered from the geological survey maps, a limestone shelf jutting out from the ridge like a lower jaw, creating a space beneath that was deep enough to shelter him and narrow enough to defend. He gathered deadfall with frantic efficiency, built a fire pit from stones and used his magnesium starter to coax flames from tinder that wanted to do anything but burn in the moisture-saturated air. The fire caught, grew, became a living thing that pushed back the darkness and created a sphere of warmth that felt like the only real thing left in the universe. Andrew fed it carefully, maintaining the balance between heat and fuel conservation, while his mind processed the day's events with the same analytical rigor he'd apply to any field study. Hypothesis. The deaths and disturbances were caused by a large predator, possibly an escaped exotic animal or an undocumented species. Evidence against: the logistics of moving 47 deer corpses, the precision of the mutilations, the lack of tracks, and the environmental anomalies that no biological entity could produce. Hypothesis. Human activity, either a cult or elaborate hoax designed to spread fear. Evidence against: the extreme isolation, the technical sophistication required, and Coleman's evident psychological deterioration. Also, critically, the feeling that Andrew couldn't shake, the certainty, bone deep and absolute, that he was being watched by something that wanted him in ways that hunger couldn't fully describe. Hypothesis. The Wendigo was real. He wrote that in his notebook, the words looking absurd in his careful field scientist handwriting, drew a line under them, stared at them while the fire crackled and the darkness beyond pressed close with almost physical weight. If it was real, what did that mean? That folklore was fact, that the rationalist framework he'd built his entire worldview upon was fatally incomplete, that the indigenous peoples who'd lived here for 10,000 years knew things that Western science was too arrogant to acknowledge, or that there were phenomena in the universe that defied categorization, that existed in spaces between empiricism and myth, that could only be approached through frameworks his culture had abandoned centuries ago. The howl came again, closer this time, and with it came the cold. Not natural cold, weaponized cold that made his earlier measurements seem tropical by comparison. The fire dimmed despite the fuel, flames shrinking as if the heat itself was being consumed by something invisible. Andrew's breath crystallized instantly. His exposed skin went numb. The water in his canteen, rated for -40 degrees, froze solid with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. It was here. Andrew couldn't see it. The darkness beyond the firelight was complete, absolute, a void that seemed to swallow even the concept of illumination. But he could feel its presence, could hear the sound of something moving through the forest with a gait that was wrong, joints bending in directions that biology shouldn't allow. Could smell it now too, an odor of spoiled meat and winter ice, and underneath it all, something sharp and metallic that his hindbrain identified as blood. "I know what you are," Andrew said, his voice steadier than he'd expected, speaking to the darkness because silence felt like surrender. "Wendigo, spirit of hunger. You were human once. Coleman, maybe. Someone who broke the taboo." The movement stopped. In the sudden silence, Andrew could hear his own heartbeat far too fast, pumping blood that felt sluggish in the cold. Could hear the fire struggling to stay alive. Could hear from the darkness a sound that might have been breath or might have been laughter, dry and thin and utterly devoid of humor. "You can't be real," Andrew continued, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "You violate every principle of thermodynamics. The temperature manipulation alone would require energy expenditure that no organic system could." The thing in the darkness stepped forward. Just one step, but it brought it to the absolute edge of the firelight where Andrew could finally see what had been pursuing him. His mind tried to reject the image, to categorize it as shadows and tricks of light. But the thing was too solid, too specific, too terribly present to dismiss. Antlers just as Coleman had drawn, but worse in reality. They sprouted from a skull that was elongated like a deer's but sized like a human's, covered in skin so thin and stretched that every contour of bone showed beneath. The body was emaciated to the point of impossibility, ribs like knife blades pressing against gray flesh that looked freezer-burned, limbs too long and jointed in too many places. But the worst part was the eyes. They were human, remained human despite all the other transformations, and in them Andrew saw awareness, intelligence and hunger so vast it made the Grand Canyon seem like a minor depression. It opened its mouth. The jaw distended, unhinged, revealing rows of teeth that were all incisors, all sharp, designed for tearing rather than chewing. When it spoke, the voice was Coleman's, but layered with harmonics that suggested dozens of voices speaking in unison, all the victims it had consumed adding their tones to its speech. "You understand incorrectly, Ranger." The words came in English, but beneath them Andrew heard that other language, the Ojibwe words flowing like an undercurrent. "I don't violate your physics. I am physics. I am the entropy at the end of all things, the heat death of the universe given form in this small place. Every living thing burns its fuel and produces cold. I am that cold collected and concentrated and given purpose." "That's not..." Andrew's voice broke. "Thermodynamics doesn't work that way. Your thermodynamics measures a closed system. The universe is not closed. There are cracks, spaces where the rules thin and older equations apply." The Wendigo tilted its head, antlers scraping against the rock ceiling of the overhang. "Do you know why I take the liver? Your Coleman theorized it was spiritual, that the soul resides there. Primitive thinking. No. The liver processes toxins, stores energy, maintains the warmth that lets you think you're separate from the world. It's the furnace. I consume it because I remember what warmth felt like, even though eating only makes the hunger grow." It took another step forward. The fire guttered lower. "I was a man," it continued. Conversational now, almost gentle. "Métis trapper. Worked these woods before they were federal land. Winter of 1893. Got cut off from my camp by an early freeze. No food. No way out. By the third week I was burning my boots for warmth and eating the leather. Fourth week my partner died. I held out for 5 days. 5 days of staring at his frozen body and feeling my own organs start to shut down. When I finally cut into his thigh, I told myself it was survival. Just protein. Just fuel." The thing that had been a man leaned closer, and Andrew could see how its skin wept fluid that froze into rivulets of ice, could count the vertebrae of its spine pressing against gray flesh like beads on a string. But I didn't stop with what I needed to survive. I ate everything. Consumed him so completely that no one would ever know he'd existed. And when I returned to civilization, the hunger came with me. It grew, spread, became something that couldn't be satisfied by normal means. So I fled back here to the deep woods and I hunted, deer at first, then other trappers, then anyone unlucky enough to cross my territory. Your Coleman makes number 83 across 132 years. You can't have survived that long, Andrew said. But the words were reflex rather than conviction. He was bargaining with physics because he didn't know how else to bargain. Human cells don't... I'm not human anymore. Haven't been for decades. The cold preserves me. The hunger sustains me. And every person I consume adds their warmth to the void inside me. But it's never enough. It will never be enough. That's the punishment. That's the transformation. To need eternally, and to know that needing is all that will ever remain. Andrew's hand crept toward his pack, toward the emergency flare gun that was probably useless, but represented action, choice, the possibility that he wasn't completely helpless. "You're thinking weapons," the Wendigo observed. "Fire. Force. You theorize that significant heat might counter me, that I'm vulnerable to things that burn. This is partially correct. But you'd need a heat source that could overcome a century of accumulated cold, and you don't have that. What you have is 15 minutes before hypothermia begins to shut down your cognitive function, 30 before you lose motor control, 90 before your heart stops. Then why are we talking? Why not just..." Andrew couldn't finish the sentence, because I remember being rational. Remember the pleasure of analysis, of understanding. It's all I have left besides hunger, these fragments of the man I was. The Wendigo's voice carried something that might have been sadness. "And because I want you to know what's happening, to understand that I'm not evil. Not a monster, not really. Just a natural process taken to its logical conclusion. The universe wants heat death. I'm just helping it along." The creature moved with speed that should have been impossible for something so emaciated. One moment it was at the fire's edge, the next it was on Andrew, bearing him backward with force that drove the air from his lungs. Claws, no, not claws, fingers that had grown too long and developed points like knives, pinned his shoulders. The smell of decay was overwhelming, filling Andrew's nose and mouth until he gagged. "I'll start with your liver," the Wendigo whispered, breath like January wind. "Quick, almost painless, then the heart while it still beats. The warmth is better when the blood is fresh. After that it doesn't matter. You'll be gone to wherever it is we go, and I'll be here, still hungry, waiting for the next one." Andrew's hand found the flare gun, pulled it free, pressed it against the creature's chest and fired. The projectile detonated with light so bright it whited out his vision, with heat that registered as pain before it registered as warmth. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that contained all 83 of its victims, and stumbled backward. Where the flare had struck, flesh blackened and burned, revealing bone underneath that glowed red with heat transfer. But the wound was healing. Even as Andrew watched, the burned flesh began to regenerate, drawing matter from somewhere, from the surrounding air, from the darkness itself, to repair the damage. Slower than the injury, but healing nonetheless. "Clever," the Wendigo said, appraising him with those human eyes. "Magnesium burns at 3,000 degrees, enough to damage even me. But one flare, one moment of pain against a century of cold, the mathematics don't favor you." It was right. Andrew knew it was right. He had nothing that could permanently harm something that had transcended biological limits, that drew its existence from sources his science couldn't measure. He was going to die here, and then he was going to become part of it. Another voice in the chorus, another fragment of warmth feeding the eternal hunger, unless he could give it what it wanted in a way it couldn't consume. "The Ojibwe trapped Wendigos," Andrew said, forcing his voice steady. "I read the accounts. They didn't try to kill them, they bound them. Ceremonies, specific words, medicine that addressed the spiritual aspect rather than the physical." The Wendigo paused. "You don't believe in that. You believe in what you can measure." "I believe in what's standing in front of me. I believe in adapting my model when the data demands it." Andrew's mind raced, pulling fragments from papers he'd read, from the anthropological surveys that had seemed like quaint ethnography when he'd reviewed them. Windigu Wabandamoan, the Wendigo ceremony. It required 7 medicine people, 7 days of fasting, specific songs in specific order. None of which you have. No, but I have one thing you don't. I'm still human, still connected to the world in ways you've lost, and that matters, doesn't it? That's why you talk, why you explain. Because some part of you, some fragment of the man from 1893, wants to be understood, wants to be released. The Wendigo was silent for a long moment. The fire had died to embers, but Andrew's eyes had adjusted enough to see the creature's expression. the play of something like longing across features that were too wrong to properly convey emotion. "If I teach you the words," it finally said, "if I give you the ceremony that might bind me, you'll use it. You'll trap me here forever, conscious and starving but unable to hunt, unable to even move. A century of hunger will become a millennium, an eternity. Or you'll be released." The account suggests that's possible, that the binding creates a space where the transformation can reverse, where the spirit can move on. Andrew was improvising now, synthesizing fragmentary knowledge into something that might resemble truth. Isn't that better than this? Than endless cycling through the same hunger, the same kills forever? "It's been so long," the Wendigo said, and its voice was suddenly just Coleman's, human and broken and terribly young. "So long since I felt anything but cold and need. I don't remember my first name. Don't remember my mother's face. Just the hunger. Just the moment I cut into Jean-Baptiste's leg and everything changed. Then help me end it. For you. For Coleman. For all the others you've absorbed. Let them rest." The creature that had been a man for 83 consumed lives lowered itself until it crouched before Andrew, antlers scraping the stone. When it spoke again, the words were in Ojibwe, flowing and rhythmic, a language that carried weight beyond meaning. Andrew didn't understand them, but he felt them, felt the shape they made in the air, the way they interacted with the cold and the darkness. He listened, memorized. And when the Wendigo finished speaking, when it had given him every word of a ceremony that might bind or release it, Andrew began. The words felt wrong in his mouth, consonants that his English-trained tongue couldn't quite produce, but he forced them out. Repeated the phrases as the Wendigo had taught him. 7 iterations, 7 cycles through the ceremony. His voice was hoarse by the 3rd repetition, failing by the 5th, but he continued because stopping meant death, his and all those who came after. On the 7th repetition, the cold intensified. Not physical cold, something else. A cold that existed in the space where physics met metaphysics, where matter touched spirit. It flowed from Andrew's words, from his intention, from his desperate need to survive combined with his academic need to understand. The cold wrapped around the Wendigo like chains, like roots, binding it to the spot where it crouched. The creature screamed, not in pain but in release, in recognition, in something that might have been gratitude. The antlers began to fade, becoming translucent, becoming shadow. The emaciated body lost its definition, edges blurring into the darkness. For just a moment, Andrew saw the man underneath, weathered and bearded and terribly thin, but human, unmistakably human, before that too faded. "Thank you," said a voice that was just Coleman, just the trapper, just all the victims speaking as one. "Thank you for remembering us." Then the Wendigo was gone. The cold retreated. The fire, which had died to nothing, suddenly flared back to life with a whoosh that suggested all the heat that had been stolen was returning at once. Andrew's body, which had been shutting down by degrees, suddenly flooded with warmth that bordered on painful. He sat there until dawn, feeding the fire and watching the forest slowly return to normalcy. Birds began to call. Small animals rustled through underbrush. The wind picked up, but it was just wind now, carrying nothing but weather. When the rescue helicopter found him 12 hours later, guided by his emergency beacon, Andrew gave his report in careful, measured terms. Large predator, species uncertain, appeared to have migrated out of the region. Coleman's body had not been located, but evidence suggested death by exposure. The deer deaths remained unexplained but followed patterns consistent with unknown disease vector. He didn't mention the Wendigo, didn't try to explain the ceremony or the binding or the moment when something impossible ceased to be. Some truths couldn't be transcribed in field notes, couldn't be photographed or measured or submitted to peer review. But he kept the notebook, kept the words he'd memorized, the phrases in Ojibwe that had given him power over something that should not exist. Kept them because somewhere in the boundary waters, bound but not destroyed, the cold waited. Would always wait, and if it ever broke free, if the binding weakened or the ceremony faded, someone would need to know how to renew it. Andrew Clark returned to his life, completed his wildlife biology work, published papers on predator-prey dynamics that were well received and thoroughly conventional. But he also began studying Ojibwe language, started attending tribal consultations, made friends with elders who remembered the old stories, the old ways of understanding the world, because he'd learned something in that frozen forest that his master's degree had never taught him. That rationality was a tool, not a prison. That the map was not the territory. That the universe was larger and stranger than his equations had suggested, and that surviving in it meant being willing to use any framework that worked, even frameworks his culture had forgotten. On winter nights when the temperature dropped and the wind came from the north, Andrew would sometimes take out his notebook and review the words, remind himself of the ceremony, make sure he could still produce the sounds correctly, still trace the patterns that bound cold and hunger in place, just in case. Because the forest remembered even if people forgot. The forest remembered the trappers and the rangers and the hikers who'd vanished into its depths, remembered the Wendigo and all the others like it, spirits and entities that existed in the spaces between empiricism and myth, remembered that humans were temporary visitors in a landscape that belonged to older things, things that followed rules written before the first word was spoken. And sometimes on the very coldest nights, when the wind howled in from Canada and the stars seemed sharp enough to cut, Andrew would hear an echo of that voice, not threatening, not hunting, just acknowledging, a confirmation that the binding held, that the ceremony had worked, at least for now. At least for now. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The map was wrong. Amanda Foster had checked it 3 times against the GPS coordinates, against the geological survey, against her own eyes. The lake that shouldn't exist was freezing in November, 30 yards from where Nicole Porter's tent still stood, zipped from the outside. Amanda crouched beside the tent, her breath forming clouds in the sharp Oregon air. 8 years as a ranger at Crater Lake National Park had taught her to trust data over instinct, but the data here made no sense. According to every map she carried, the USGS topographical, the NPS trail guide, even the outdated 1987 survey, this depression shouldn't hold water. The elevation was wrong, the drainage was wrong. Yet here it was, roughly 40 feet across, surface already showing skim ice despite the temperature holding at 38 degrees. She pulled out her Garmin eTrex, compared the coordinates again. 42.9446 degrees N, 122, 10-90 degrees in W. The numbers matched Nicole Porter's last known location from the emergency locator beacon that had transmitted for exactly 7 minutes before going silent. But the topography didn't match anything in the database. Foster, you copy? The Motorola radio crackled at her hip. She keyed the mic. Go ahead, dispatch. Any sign of Porter? Amanda looked at the tent again. Tent's here, sealed from outside. No sign of struggle. But Jim... She paused, choosing her words carefully. There's a body of water here that's not on any of our maps. A longer pause. Say again? I'm looking at a lake, maybe 50 feet diameter. It's not in the system. Could be seasonal runoff. In November? At 7,200 feet? Amanda pulled her notebook from her jacket. I'm documenting everything, going to check the tent now. Copy. Weather's moving in. You've got maybe 2 hours before the road closes. Amanda acknowledged and clicked off. She photographed the tent from multiple angles, noting the frost patterns on the nylon. The zipper was pulled completely shut, the slider locked in place. Nicole Porter's Subaru sat in the Cleetwood Cove trailhead lot, keys in the ignition, phone in the cup holder showing 3% battery. A day hiker had reported the abandoned vehicle yesterday morning. Nicole had signed the trail register on November 14th at 6:47 a.m. It was now November 16th, 3:15 p.m. Amanda unzipped the tent slowly, photographing each stage. The interior was pristine. Sleeping bag laid out but not slept in. Backpack organized, nothing scattered. water bottles full, protein bars unopened. A journal sat on top of the pack, a pen marking a page. She pulled on nitrile gloves and opened the journal. The entries were methodical, organized by date and time. Nicole Porter, it seemed, was also someone who trusted documentation. Most entries described trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather observations. Amanda flipped to the final entry, dated November 14th, 8:23 p.m. The lake appeared at sunset. I've hiked this route 17 times. There has never been water here. The surface is absolutely still, no wind ripples, no insect activity. When I threw a stone, it didn't make a splash, just went through, like the water isn't quite solid, or isn't quite water. I can see someone standing in the center. A woman, I think, in white. She hasn't moved in 40 minutes. I called out twice. No response. The temperature has dropped 15 degrees since I set up camp. My thermometer reads 31 degrees, but the lake isn't frozen. I don't want to be here when it gets dark. The entry ended. No further pages were written on. Amanda sat back on her heels, feeling the cold seeping through her knees. She looked out at the impossible lake. The surface was empty now, just that thin layer of ice reflecting the gray sky. She photographed each page of the journal, then carefully placed it in an evidence bag. Her training said to secure the scene, call for additional units, wait for the investigation team. Her training also said that lakes didn't appear overnight in locations where geological surveys showed solid bedrock. She stood and walked to the edge of the water. The shore was clean, no mud, no vegetation disturbed, no footprints. Just rock and then water, as if someone had drawn a line and filled it in. She knelt and reached out to touch the surface. The water was warm. Amanda jerked her hand back, stared at her wet fingers. The air temperature was 36 degrees. The water should be near freezing. She pulled out her infrared thermometer, pointed it at the lake. The reading flickered between 98.6 and 99.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Body temperature. She stood quickly, putting distance between herself and the shore. Her mind automatically reached for explanations. Geothermal activity, hot spring, volcanic vent. But Crater Lake was a caldera, yes, the collapsed remains of Mount Mazama, but there were no active thermal features in this area. The lake itself, the big lake, the one that was supposed to be here, sat 2 miles north. This was just ridgeline, solid rock, dry. The radio crackled again. Foster, we're getting some weird readings on the weather radar. Temperature inversion forming over your position. You need to start heading back. Amanda keyed the mic. Copy. Need another 20 minutes to process the scene. You don't have 20 minutes. This front is moving faster than predicted. She looked up. The sky had darkened, clouds lowering like a ceiling. Understood. Movement across the lake stopped her mid-sentence. A figure stood in the center of the water. White clothing, long black hair, absolutely motionless. Amanda's rational mind immediately cataloged possibilities. Another hiker, someone injured, hypothermia victim. But the figure was standing on the water, not in it. Standing where the depth should be at least 15 feet, if the depression followed any normal geology. Foster, you still there? Yeah. Her voice came out steady despite her pulse hammering. Yeah, I'm here. Jim, I need you to check something in the database. Any missing persons cases in this park involving water? Specifically drowning or bodies recovered from water? You found something? Just check, all years. Go back as far as the records go. That's going to take some time. I'll wait. She kept her eyes on the figure. It didn't move, didn't sway, didn't shift weight, didn't seem to breathe. The distance was maybe 40 feet. Amanda pulled out her binoculars. Through the lenses, details sharpened. The figure was female, wearing what looked like a white dress or gown that hung to mid-calf. The fabric was wet, clinging to thin limbs. Long black hair obscured the face, hanging straight down past the shoulders. Bare feet stood on the ice-filmed surface. Hello? Amanda called across the water. Are you injured? The figure didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the voice at all. This is National Park Service. If you need help, I need you to respond. Nothing. Amanda lowered the binoculars, pulled out her camera, and zoomed in. Through the viewfinder, she could see more detail. The dress wasn't quite white, more of a pale gray stained with darker patches. The hair moved slightly despite no wind. And the feet? Amanda's finger hesitated on the shutter button. The feet weren't quite touching the surface. The figure hovered maybe an inch above the water, suspended in a way that made her eyes hurt to process. She took the photo anyway. The shutter clicked 3 times in rapid succession. The figure's head tilted. Not lifted, tilted, sideways, at an angle that suggested a broken neck. The hair slid aside slightly, and Amanda caught a glimpse of pale skin, dark eyes, and something wrong with the mouth. Too wide. Open too far. Amanda stepped backward, her boot heel catching on a rock. She stumbled, caught herself, and when she looked up again, the figure was gone. The lake surface was empty. Just ice in that impossible warm water. Her radio crackled with static, then Jim's voice came through. "Foster, I've got something. Hold on, pulling up the file now." Amanda kept her eyes on the water, camera still raised. "Go ahead." "Okay, this is interesting. We've got 4 missing persons cases in the park since 1985. 3 of them were eventually found, 2 fell on trails, 1 had a medical emergency, but there's 1 still open. Woman named Yuki Tanaka, Japanese national, age 28, went missing in August 1994, last seen on the Rim Drive near Discovery Point. Recovered? Never found. But here's the weird part. Her diary was recovered from her car. Final entry talked about seeing a lake of tears that appeared at sunset. Rangers searched the area extensively. No water source matching her description was ever located. Amanda's skin prickled despite her heavy jacket. Any connection to the current missing person? Nothing obvious. Different demographic, different time of year, different... Wait, hold on. Papers rustled over the radio. Both were staying at the same campground, Mazama Village. Both logged complaints about their rooms the night before they disappeared. What kind of complaints? Water damage. Both said their rooms smelled like wet fabric and there was condensation on the walls despite the heat being on. Maintenance checked both times, found nothing. Amanda looked back at Nicole's tent. The nylon showed no water damage, no unusual moisture. But the inside had felt different somehow. Heavy, like the air was saturated even though everything appeared dry. "Jim, I need you to pull any other reports of unexplained water phenomena in the park. Any time period. Sightings, seasonal changes, anything that doesn't match geological surveys. That's going to be a deep dive. I know, but I think..." Amanda paused. The temperature had dropped again. She could see her breath now. Thick white clouds. "I think there's a pattern here." "What kind of pattern?" She didn't answer immediately. Across the lake, fog was forming, not rising from the water like normal mist, appearing in place, manifesting in vertical columns that grew thicker as she watched. The columns moved closer together, forming a barrier. "Foster? I need to go. I'll be back at the station in 90 minutes. She clicked off before he could respond, started packing her equipment. The tent would stay. It was evidence. She photographed everything one more time, marked the GPS coordinates, and turned back toward the trail. The fog had spread while she worked. What should have been a clear line of sight to the Rim Drive was now completely obscured. Amanda pulled out her compass, watched the needle spin lazily before settling on north. She double-checked with the GPS. Both agreed. The trail back should be visible from here. It was only half a mile through sparse woods to the road. She started walking, counting steps. 50 paces should bring her to the trail marker. At 48, she stopped. The lake was in front of her. Amanda turned around slowly. Nicole's tent sat behind her exactly where it should be. She looked at her compass again. She'd walked north. The lake was south of the campsite, but now it blocked her path. She walked east instead, parallel to the shore, keeping the water on her left. After 200 yards, she should hit the trail. Instead, she found herself back at the tent, approaching from the opposite side. The lake had moved, or she had circled without realizing it. Amanda pulled out her GPS, watched the screen flicker. The coordinates jumped erratically. 42.9446, 42.9501, 42.9382, 42.9446. She was simultaneously in multiple locations, or the satellites couldn't get a fix, or something was interfering with the signal. She tried the radio. Static hissed back at her, no voice underneath. The fog pressed closer, thick enough now that she couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The temperature continued to drop. Her thermometer read 23 degrees. Think logically, she told herself. Fog formation requires specific conditions: temperature inversions, moisture saturation, pressure systems. This was forming too fast, too thick, in conditions that shouldn't support it, which meant her fundamental assumptions about the environment were wrong, or something else was happening. She didn't want to consider something else. Something else meant abandoning the framework she'd built her career on. Amanda made a decision. She walked directly toward the lake. If she was being turned around spatially, the one constant was the water. If she crossed it, she should come out the other side in a known location. The lake was only 40 feet across. Even if she had to wade, even if the water was deep, she could manage 40 feet. At the shore, she stopped. The warm water lapped gently against the rocks now, creating ripples that hadn't been there before. The surface was no longer freezing. Steam rose in tendrils, mixing with the fog. Amanda knelt, looked down into the water. It was perfectly clear. She could see the bottom. Smooth rock, no vegetation, no debris. The depth looked to be maybe 10 feet at the center. Manageable. She stood, prepared to wade in, and saw the reflection. Not her own reflection. Another face looking up from the water. Pale skin, dark eyes, black hair spreading in the current like ink. The mouth was open too wide, showing too many teeth. As Amanda stared, the reflection's hand reached upward, breaking the surface from below. Amanda threw herself backward as water exploded upward. The figure erupted from the lake, water streaming from the white dress, hair whipping despite no wind. The head was tilted at that wrong angle, and up close Amanda could see the skin was mottled, discolored, the texture of something that had been submerged too long. The mouth opened wider and a sound came out that was simultaneously a scream and rushing water and something breaking. Amanda felt it in her chest, in her teeth, vibrating through her skeleton. She turned and ran into the fog, abandoning equipment and protocol and rational thought. Behind her, she heard water falling, heavy and constant, like a waterfall that shouldn't exist. And underneath it, footsteps. Wet footsteps. Running footsteps. Getting closer. Amanda's boot caught on something and she went down hard, sliding on frost-slicked rock. She rolled, came up in a crouch, and realized she was at the edge of the lake again. But the perspective was wrong. She was looking at Nicole's tent from the opposite side, which meant she'd run in a complete circle in under 30 seconds. The fog cleared slightly, and she saw the figure standing 10 feet away, close enough now to see the details she didn't want to see. Fingernails torn and bleeding, skin split at the joints, water constantly dripping from the hair and dress and mouth. The eyes were the worst, completely black, reflecting nothing, absorbing light. The figure's head straightened with a sound like cracking ice. The mouth moved, and words came out in a voice that sounded like drowning. "Why did you leave me?" Amanda's analytical mind tried to process. Different voice, different face. Not Nicole Porter, someone else. She forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head the other way, studying her. "You let the water take me. You all let the water take me." Standing on the shore while I screamed. I don't understand. 20 years. The voice was multiple voices now, overlapping. 20 years at the bottom, looking up at the sky, watching shadows pass. No one looked down. Yuki Tanaka. Amanda's mind made the connection even as every survival instinct screamed at her to run. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I wasn't here. I wasn't here when you You're here now." The figure stepped forward, leaving wet footprints that steamed on the cold rock. "She's here now too, down at the bottom where I was. We're all at the bottom now." "Nicole Porter? She's alive?" The figure laughed, and it was the sound of bubbles escaping from lungs that no longer needed air. "Alive, dead. What difference in the water? We're all drowning together, drowning forever." Amanda looked past the figure at the lake. The surface had changed. Instead of reflecting the sky, it now showed faces. Dozens of faces, pressed against the underside of the water like a membrane, mouths open, hands reaching up. "How many?" Amanda whispered. "How many did you lose? How many fell through ice, waded too deep, slipped on wet rocks? How many did you stop searching for?" The figure was closer now, within arm's reach. The smell of stagnant water was overwhelming. "We remember. We all remember. The water remembers everything it takes." Amanda's hand found her radio, keyed it desperately. Jim, if you can hear me, I need immediate evacuation from..." She stopped. She didn't know where she was anymore. The coordinates were meaningless. The geography had rewritten itself. The figure reached out with one pale, waterlogged hand, touched Amanda's face with fingers that were simultaneously ice-cold and fever-hot. "Don't worry, the water is warm now, so warm, body temperature, like being held." Amanda jerked away and her heel found empty air. She'd backed to the edge of the lake without realizing it. She teetered, arms windmilling, and felt herself falling backward. The water caught her like hands. It was warm, exactly as the figure had said. 98.6 degrees, the temperature of human blood. Amanda kicked upward, broke the surface, gasped for air. The shore was impossibly far away now, hundreds of feet, though she'd fallen from the edge. The fog had cleared and she could see the entire lake stretching in all directions, far larger than 40 feet. Miles, maybe. An ocean contained in a space that shouldn't exist. Something grabbed her ankle and pulled. Amanda managed one breath before going under. The water was clear. She could see everything. The bottom wasn't 10 feet down. It was bottomless, darkness stretching into depths that defied physics. And rising from those depths were figures. Hundreds of them. Thousands. All in white, all with long dark hair, all ascending toward her with hands outstretched. She kicked frantically, broke the surface again. The shore was even farther now. Nicole Porter's tent was a tiny speck in the distance. She tried to swim toward it, but the current, there shouldn't be a current in a standing body of water, pulled her toward the center. "Stop fighting." The voice came from all around her, from the water itself. "Everyone stops fighting eventually. The water always wins." Amanda dove instead, swimming down, trying to slip beneath the rising figures. Her ranger training had included cold water rescue. She knew how to survive submersion. Stay calm, conserve oxygen, assess the situation rationally, but nothing about this was rational. The water temperature remained constant as she descended. No thermocline, no pressure change. She could see the bottom now, smooth white stone that glowed with its own light. And carved into that stone were symbols she didn't recognize, flowing script that hurt to look at directly. A hand closed on her wrist. Amanda looked up into a face she recognized from the file photos. Yuki Tanaka, or what was left of her. The woman smiled, showing teeth stained black. "Welcome to the water that weeps. Welcome to the lake of souls." More hands grabbed her arms, her legs, her hair. Dozens of hands pulling her in different directions. She opened her mouth to scream and water rushed in, warm and thick, tasting of copper and salt. Her lungs seized, her vision darkened at the edges, and the last thing she saw before consciousness fled was her own face looking back at her from the glowing stone bottom. Her reflection, waiting at the bottom for 20 years, screaming silently while the world moved on above. Amanda jerked awake, coughing water. She was on the shore, lying on cold rock. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and orange. She rolled onto her side and vomited what felt like gallons of warm water onto the stone. When she could breathe again, She sat up slowly. Nicole Porter's tent stood exactly where it had been. The lake was still there, 40 feet across, surface calm. Steam rose from it in the cooling air. No figures, no faces, no hands reaching up. Her equipment was scattered but present. Radio, GPS, camera, notebook, all functional. The GPS showed the correct coordinates. 42.9446 degree or N, 122.1090 degree W. The time was 5:47 p.m. She'd lost 2 hours. Amanda checked her gear methodically, forcing her shaking hands to work. Everything was wet. Not just damp, soaked through, as if she'd been completely submerged. Her thermometer read 34 degrees. She was hypothermic, or should be. But she felt warm. Fever warm. She pulled out her camera and reviewed the photos. The tent, the journal, the impossible lake. But when she got to the image of the figure standing on the water, the screen showed only static. Not corrupted data, active static, shifting and moving. She deleted the photo, and the static spread to the next image, and the next, consuming her entire photo roll. The radio crackled. Jim's voice clear and concerned. "Foster, what's your status? You went off channel 2 hours ago." Amanda keyed the mic with numb fingers. I'm here. I'm okay." "You don't sound okay. You need medical?" She looked at the lake. The surface was freezing now, proper ice forming. It looked normal. It looked like it had always been there, a natural feature of the landscape. No medical. I'm coming back now." "Copy that. What about Porter?" Amanda watched the ice thicken. Underneath it, she could see shadows moving. Or maybe it was just the refraction, the way light bent through frozen water. Maybe it was nothing. No sign of Porter. Tents here, no signs of struggle. She's not in the immediate area. "We'll expand the search in the morning. Weather's closing in now. You need to move." "Understood." She gathered her equipment, careful not to look at the lake directly. As she turned to leave, something made her stop. On the ground beside Nicole's tent, scratched into the rock with what looked like fingernails, were words. "I came back different." Amanda stared at the message. Her handwriting. She recognized the way she formed the capital I, the specific slant of the letters. But she had no memory of writing it. She photographed the message with her phone, then started the hike back to Rim Drive. The trail was exactly where it should be, clearly marked, easy to follow. The fog had lifted completely. Within 20 minutes, she reached her truck, still parked in the Cleetwood Cove lot. Jim was waiting, leaning against his own vehicle. "Jesus, Foster, you look like hell. You sure you don't need to get checked out?" "I'm fine, just cold." She wasn't cold. She was burning up. But she couldn't explain that. Find anything else weird up there? Amanda thought about the lake. The faces, the hands, the figure that had touched her cheek with fingers that were all wrong. Just the tent and the journal. "I'll write up a full report." Jim nodded, but he was looking at her strangely. "Your lips are blue, and you're shivering pretty bad. At least let me drive you back to the station." She agreed because arguing would raise more questions. In the truck heater blasting, she pulled out her phone to review the photo of the scratched message. The image was clear, but the text had changed. It now read, "We are all at the bottom now." Amanda deleted the photo. It reappeared immediately in her gallery. She deleted it again. It came back with new text. "The water remembers." She turned off her phone and watched the darkening forest pass outside the window. Jim was talking about search protocols for tomorrow, about bringing in cadaver dogs, about checking the records for similar cases. Amanda nodded at appropriate moments, but she wasn't really listening. She was thinking about how the water had felt. Warm, embracing, like coming home to something she'd lost. And she was thinking about the face she'd seen at the bottom of that impossible lake. Her own face, looking up with black eyes and too many teeth, smiling at her return. At the ranger station, she wrote her report mechanically. Tent located, evidence secured, no sign of Nicole Porter. Unexplained body of water at coordinates, not matching any geological surveys. Recommend follow-up investigation. She didn't mention the figure, didn't mention the drowning, didn't mention waking up on the shore with 2 hours missing. That night in her apartment in Klamath Falls, she stood in the shower for an hour, trying to wash away the feeling of that warm water. It didn't work. When she finally got out and looked in the mirror, she saw it. A wet handprint on her shoulder blade, visible through the steam. 5 fingers, too long with black marks at the tips like fingerprints left in algae. She turned around quickly. Nothing was behind her. But when she looked at the mirror again, there was another handprint on the glass, and another on the wall, and another on the door, all appearing while she watched, left by hands that weren't there. Amanda grabbed her phone, thinking to call Jim, to call someone to report this. But when she unlocked the screen, her background had changed. Instead of the default mountain landscape, it showed a photo she didn't remember taking. Herself, standing at the edge of the impossible lake, looking into the camera. Behind her, dozens of figures in white stood in the water. They were all looking at the camera too, all smiling. She dropped the phone. When she picked it up again, the background was normal, but her photo gallery now contained thousands of new images. All the same, the lake, the figures, herself, repeated over and over, standing at the edge looking toward the camera, expression growing gradually more vacant in each shot, until in the final image, she was just another figure in white, standing in the water, head tilted at that wrong angle, mouth open too wide. Amanda deleted her entire gallery. It repopulated instantly. She turned off the phone completely, pulled the battery out. She would get a new phone tomorrow, new equipment, new everything. But that night lying in bed, she heard water dripping, constant dripping like a slow leak. She checked the bathroom, nothing. Checked the kitchen sink, dry. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, and underneath it, just barely audible, she heard voices. Multiple voices overlapping, all saying the same words. "Why did you leave us? Why did you leave us at the bottom?" She pulled the pillow over her head, but the voices continued. And she realized with growing horror that one of those voices was her own. The next morning, Jim called before she'd even gotten out of bed. "Foster, you sitting down?" She was lying down actually, having not slept at all. "What is it?" "They found Nicole Porter." Amanda's heart lurched. "Where?" That's the weird part. She walked into a ranger station in Mount Rainier National Park. That's 200 miles north. She says she has no memory of the last 3 days. Says the last thing she remembers is setting up her tent at Crater Lake, and then she was in Washington, standing outside a visitor center. Is she hurt? Medically, she's fine. But Foster... Jim paused. "They're sending me the photos from her examination. There's something you need to see." The image arrived moments later. Nicole Porter, wearing a hospital gown, standing against a white wall. She looked tired but unharmed, except for the handprints covering her skin, black handprints, hundreds of them overlapping, covering her arms and legs and neck. The same handprints Amanda had seen on her own bathroom walls. And in the background of the photo, just barely visible in the reflection of a metal cabinet, was a figure in white with long black hair standing directly behind Nicole. The photographer hadn't noticed it. The medical staff hadn't noticed it. But it was there, clear as day, hands resting on Nicole's shoulders. Amanda looked down at her own arms. In the morning light, she could see them now, faint black marks barely visible but spreading. Fingerprints that weren't hers, overlapping and multiplying. Her phone buzzed with another text from Jim. "She keeps asking about you. Says she dreamed about you drowning. Says she saw you at the bottom of a lake, standing with a bunch of other people. She wants to know if you're okay." Amanda typed back, "I'm fine. Taking a personal day. We'll be back tomorrow." But she wouldn't be fine. She knew that now. The water had marked her. Whatever lived in that impossible lake had touched her, had left something behind, had taken something else. She could feel it inside her, cold and warm at the same time, foreign but familiar. Growing. She went to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked back with eyes that were maybe a shade darker than they'd been yesterday. Her skin maybe a shade paler, and when she tilted her head just slightly, she felt it move too easily, heard something crack. Outside her window, rain had started falling. It wasn't in the forecast. The sky had been clear moments ago, but now water streamed down the glass, and in the patterns of the droplets she could see faces. All the faces from the bottom of the lake, all looking at her, all smiling. Amanda closed the curtains. She would call in sick. She would take time off, figure this out, find a rational explanation. There had to be a rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation if you looked at the data correctly. But deep down, in the part of her that now felt like drowning, she knew the truth. The lake wasn't just water. It was a door, and she'd opened it, or it had opened her. Either way, she was changed. And somewhere in Crater Lake National Park, in a location not marked on any map, an impossible lake was growing, fed by rain that fell only there, waiting for the next person to find it, waiting to show them what lived at the bottom, waiting to bring them home. Because the water always remembers what it takes, and it never, ever lets go. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.